Meanwhile, Vasper and Chanty materialized inside the shower of Chanty's bathroom, having teleported straight from the golden bath dome. As they arrived, their bodies were both coated in the shimmering, molten-like golden liquid. Chanty was covered up to her neck, while Vasper had only half of his body drenched, the luminous substance clinging to his shorts and shirt. The moment they landed, Chanty immediately struggled to break free from Vasper's grasp, her expression heavy with emotion, clearly not in the mood. The sight she had just witnessed in the dome still burned in her mind. Even though she knew it wasn't Vasper's fault that Lauren had kissed him, she couldn't help the furious storm raging inside her. The jealousy clawed at her heart and mind, the image of another woman's lips pressed against Vasper searing into her thoughts. Vasper, on the other hand, remained silent, simply observing Chanty's every move. Without a word, Chanty turned away and turned on the shower, letting the warm water wash away the golden liquid from her skin. She didn't look at him. Her back was stiff with anger, her silence heavier than words. Vasper clenched his jaw at her cold reaction. He understood her frustration, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. He let her be, giving her space, but his eyes remained locked on her. Mesmerized. The water cascaded down her back, taking the golden liquid with it, swirling down the drain. The way her body glistened under the water, her curves sculpted to perfection, made it impossible for him to look away. The soft golden-brown waves of her hair cascaded down her back, adding to the ethereal beauty that had him utterly entranced. But no matter how much he tried to keep his distance, he couldn't deny the fire igniting in his veins. His body reacted instinctively, his arousal straining against his soaked shorts. Yet, he hesitated. He could see the tension in Chanty's posture. She was still upset, still hurting. Touching her now might only push her further away. When the shower finally turned off, Chanty wasted no time. She walked away without so much as a glance in his direction, heading toward the bathrobe hanging by the wall. Vasper's gaze followed her, his body still humming with need. Without a second thought, he peeled off his wet clothes, stepping under the shower once more, letting the water cleanse him as his eyes stayed fixed on her reflection in the mirror. Chanty stood in front of it, drying her hair with a blower, her face still dark with irritation. She refused to look at him, her expression set in stubborn defiance. Once Vasper was done, he hung his wet clothes and stepped out of the shower, completely bare. He moved toward his own bathrobe, the cool air sending a shiver down his spine, but something else made his pulse spike, Chanty's gaze. Even though she wasn't staring openly, he caught the way her eyes flickered toward him in secret. She watched him as he walked, her breath catching slightly. She saw everything, his toned physique, the hard lines of his muscles, and most of all, the undeniable evidence of his arousal. A blush spread across her cheeks as realization dawned on her. She quickly looked away, pretending to focus on drying her hair. But Vasper had already seen the effect he had on her, and a slow, knowing smirk curled his lips. He took a step toward her. Sensing his movement, Chanty immediately turned and walked away, heading straight to her closet. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest as she glanced at the wall clock. It was almost 4 a.m. In a little while, Mara would arrive with her morning coffee and breakfast. She needed to clear her head. But before she could even take another step, Vasper was there. His strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her flush against him. A gasp escaped her lips as she felt the unmistakable hardness pressing against her lower back. Her breath hitched. "Vasper," she whispered, her voice shaky, uncertain. But he didn't give her a chance to protest. His lips found her neck, trailing hot. Lingering kisses along her sensitive skin. His breath was warm. His lips soft yet demanding, sending waves of heat rushing through her body. Her knees weakened. Her mind screamed at her to resist, to stay angry, to push him away. But her body betrayed her. A shuddering sigh escaped her lips the moment Vasper's hands found her breasts, cupping them firmly, his fingers kneading with a slow, torturous rhythm. "Ah!" A moan slipped past her lips before she could stop it. Vasper groaned in response, the deep, husky sound vibrating against her ear, making her body ignite further. She arched against him, her hands reaching back instinctively to clutch at his neck. The fire he stoked within her burned hotter with every kiss, every touch. Vasper's heart arousal pressed even more firmly against Chanty, making her breath hitch. His palm returned to her chest, kneading with deliberate intensity, while his other hand trailed lower, slow, teasing, making her breathing quicken, her moans turning deeper. When his fingers finally reached the sensitive spot between her thighs, a sharp gasp escaped Chanty's lips. Her grip tightened around Vasper's neck, her body arching against him as waves of sensation crashed over her. Vasper let out a deep, guttural groan, his mouth seeking hers with desperate hunger. Their lips met in a fierce, consuming kiss, tongues tangling, devouring each other as if they were starved. If Vasper could steal every breath from Chanty, he would. Chanty's legs trembled, her strength slipping away with every movement of Vasper's hand. The overwhelming heat between them made her dizzy, made her want to surrender completely. She could feel just how much Vasper wanted her, his arousal pressed firmly against her lower back, hot and rigid. The intensity of their passion became unbearable, and in a fevered moment, Vasper pushed Chanty gently against the cabinet wall. The kiss never broke, their lips locked in an intoxicating dance. But her knees buckled, her body losing all strength, and before she could collapse, Vasper swept her into his arms effortlessly. Their lips remained sealed, the kiss unrelenting, as a sudden shift in the air signaled that they had teleported. When Chanty's back hit the softness beneath her, she barely registered where they were. Vasper's bed. His kingdom. But none of it mattered, her mind was clouded with desire, drowning in the fiery embrace of his lips and the overwhelming heat of his touch. Their shared gasps and moans echoed in the grand chamber, lost in the air thick with passion. Chanty lay on her stomach, her body shivering with anticipation as Vasper's lips traced a path down her back, slow, worshipping. His hands followed, gliding over every inch of her skin as if memorizing her. The way he touched her, the reverence in his every movement, sent waves of heat cascading through her body. Vasper gently lifted her leg, positioning her comfortably, her knee pressed against the bed, while her face rested against a pillow. His lips ventured lower, igniting every nerve in her body. Chanty gripped the sheets, her mouth falling open in a silent scream as pleasure consumed her. His touch, his breath, his lips, they were relentless, sending her spiraling higher and higher into bliss. She needed more. The pleasure was torturous, overwhelming, making her crave something deeper, something only he could give. She trembled beneath him, her body aching for him, her voice a breathless plea. Vasper felt it too, the undeniable need, the way her body responded to him. It was time. Kneeling behind her, he moved with deliberate slowness, his body trembling with restraint. The sensation sent shudders down his spine, and a deep moan rumbled from his chest. It was unlike anything he had ever felt, intense, consuming, overwhelming. Chanty gasped, her body adjusting, the mix of pleasure and pain making her breath catch. Vasper pressed soft kisses along her back, soothing her, his hands sliding to her most sensitive spot, drawing out even more pleasure to ease the tension. The rhythm he set was steady yet intoxicating, building a fire that burned hotter with every movement. Chanty's hands found his, her fingers tightening around his in a silent plea, one that said everything her lips couldn't. Don't stop. Vasper understood it all, even without words. Chanty didn't need to speak, her body told him everything. The way she reacted, the way her fingers gripped him desperately, the way her breath hitched and trembled as if they were climbing an endless, breathtaking peak together. Sensing her nearing the edge, Vasper moved faster, his fingers skillful and relentless, sending Chanty spiraling into pleasure. A sharp, raw cry tore from her lips, his name, dragged out in a long, needy moan. The sound ignited something feral in him, his body burning with desire. His lower lip caught between his teeth, he matched the urgency of his hands with every motion, their bodies locked in a heated, rhythmic dance. The room was filled with the sound of their bodies colliding, their moans interwoven in a symphony of passion. They were both chasing the same intoxicating high, teetering on the edge of bliss. Their names became the only thing they could utter, voices rising in pure, unfiltered pleasure. Vasper's muscles flexed, his strength evident in every movement, his power coiling like a tightly wound spring as he drove them both closer, closer. Chanty cried out into the pillow, her fingers digging into Vasper's thigh, holding on as if she were about to be consumed entirely by the pleasure crashing over her. Sensing their inevitable climax, Vasper pulled her body flush against his, wrapping her tightly in his embrace. One hand remained teasing, coaxing her deeper into bliss, while the other grasped her chest, holding her impossibly close. His lips sought hers, hungry and demanding. And Chanty, lost in the heat of the moment, met him halfway, their mouths crashing together in a searing, desperate kiss. Their bodies trembled, the final, overwhelming waves of pleasure surging through them. Chanty's muffled cry was swallowed by Vasper's lips, their moans tangled and trapped between them as they both shattered, lost in the ecstasy they had been chasing. Their bodies locked together, unwilling to let go, their heated breaths mixing as the intensity finally ebbed into a lingering warmth. The fire between them didn't extinguish, it burned steady, deep, and consuming. Chanty felt it, the final, undeniable claim of Vasper, the way he held her as if she was everything, the way his body refused to part from hers. Her legs trembled, all strength leaving her, but Vasper kept her steady, his arms the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the sheets. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Yet, they remained entwined, their bodies reluctant to separate. Chanty's eyes fluttered shut, savoring the moment, the lingering heat of Vasper's body against hers, the possessive strength of his embrace, the intoxicating scent of his breath as it ghosted over her lips. Even now, his tongue traced along hers, as if searching, savoring, unwilling to stop. Her soft moans faded into quiet exhales, their breathing finally slowing, the room settling into a hazy stillness. And then, Vasper finally pulled away, just enough to whisper against her lips, his voice low, rich, and laced with something utterly hypnotic. "I love you so much," he murmured, his tone seductive yet sincere. "You've taken me to heaven, babe. I never knew true bliss until now. Not until you." The way he spoke, the way his voice caressed her ears, it sent a shiver down Chanty's spine, her heart pounding. He wasn't just saying the words. He meant them. And at that moment, she knew she was his, completely. Soft, breathy moans spilled from Chanty's lips, a silent confession that words could never capture. She didn't need to tell Vasper how completely he had taken her to the peak of ecstasy. He knew. He felt it in the way her body trembled beneath him, in the way she clung to him as though afraid to let go. A moment later, Vasper let their bodies collapse together onto the bed, his weight pressing against her from behind. Chanty lay on her stomach, her breath still uneven, her pulse still racing. But Vasper didn't let himself slip away from her, not yet. He remained connected, deeply intertwined, refusing to break the bond between them. A quiet, breathless laugh escaped Chanty's lips, realizing that he was still there, still inside her, as though unwilling to part from her warmth. Vasper propped himself up on his elbows, hovering over her, his lips trailing lazy, lingering kisses along the bare skin of her shoulder. Chanty's eyes fluttered shut, savoring the way his lips traced every curve, every inch, as if memorizing her with his mouth alone. "If it were up to me," he whispered against her ear, his voice low and teasing, "I wouldn't let you sleep. I wouldn't let you rest." A soft, knowing smile played on Chanty's lips as she slowly opened her eyes. That was when she truly saw where they were. The walls gleamed with golden carvings, intricate details shimmering in the soft glow of the room. Everything around them exuded power, luxury, a kingdom's grandeur. Of course. This was his room. Where else would they be? "Are we in your chambers?" Chanty asked, her voice hushed, still breathless. Vasper's lips never left her skin. He didn't answer with words, only with a low, deep hum, one that vibrated against her shoulder. But even as he did, he began to move again, his hips shifting slowly, deliberately. Chanty gasped, her lips parting, her body arching at the sensation. And then, with torturous slowness, Vasper finally pulled away. A shiver ran down her spine at the loss, but she remained still, watching him from the corner of her eye. He didn't look at her immediately, but when he did, his gaze was dark, intense, consuming. He reached for her, his movements unhurried, almost predatory. Without hesitation, she followed. When their bodies met again, Vasper wasted no time. He eased her back against the bed, his body settling above hers, one forearm braced against the mattress, supporting his weight. His free hand slid between her thighs, his touch sending sparks of pleasure through her already sensitive body. Chanty's breath hitched as their eyes met, locked in a silent battle of desire. Vasper never stopped, never wavered, his fingers moving with a maddening rhythm, teasing, worshipping. Her lashes fluttered, her head tilting back, lips parting as wave after wave of pleasure coursed through her. Vasper watched her, his jaw tightening, his lips curving into something dark and sinful. And then, without warning, he dipped his head lower, his mouth finding her skin. A strangled moan escaped Chanty as his lips closed over her, his tongue tracing slow, deliberate circles, his mouth worshipping her with every flick and graze. Her hands flew to his head, fingers tangling in his hair, holding him there, urging him closer. His name spilled from her lips in broken whispers, her back arching, her body pressing against his as if desperate for more. Vasper groaned against her, the sound vibrating through her skin, making her tremble. His hands roamed her body, mapping her every curve, as though determined to claim her in every possible way. The fire between them reignited, stronger, hotter, unstoppable. Vasper's body pressed flush against hers, his muscles taut, sculpted perfection against her softness. The heat in the room was almost unbearable, thick with the intensity of their passion, their need. And yet, it still wasn't enough. "I love you." The words tumbled from Vasper's lips like a prayer, whispered against her mouth, against her skin, over and over, as if saying them alone wasn't enough to convey the depth of what he felt. Their movements became desperate, synchronized, a dance of fire and longing. Chanty met every motion, her body molding to his, her hips rising to meet him, deeper, harder. The remnants of pain were long gone, replaced by an overwhelming, consuming pleasure that drowned out everything else. She gasped, moaned, clung to him, nails raking down his back, leaving marks against his skin. Instead of slowing, Vasper growled low in his throat, his body surging forward with even more intensity, as if her touch had only spurred him on. Faster. Deeper. Harder. They chased the inevitable together, their bodies lost in the storm of sensation. Chanty's voice rose, higher, louder, until she was screaming his name. After a few moments, following the heat of their passion, Chanty found herself lying down on Vasper's arm while he gently caressed her hair. Their eyes remained locked, speaking volumes in the silence. Vasper placed soft, lingering kisses on Chanty's face, moving from her lips down to her neck, tracing a path of warmth. Chanty let him, offering no resistance, yet something deep within her stirred, a shadow of uncertainty that refused to be silenced. Yet, in the depths of her mind, she couldn't shake the memory of what she had seen in the golden bath, the way Lauren Valerian had kissed Vasper. The thought gnawed at her, refusing to fade, wrapping itself around her heart like an iron chain. Vasper, noticing the shift in her expression, gazed into her eyes as if searching for the right words. Chanty waited, silent but expectant, her breath unsteady. "Are you still upset because of Lauren?" Vasper finally asked, his voice low and smooth, his thumb teasing her lips as his heavy-lidded eyes studied her face, waiting for a response. Chanty didn't answer. She didn't know how to. She knew Vasper wasn't at fault, yet the emotions within her refused to settle, turbulent like an unrelenting storm. A knowing chuckle escaped Vasper's lips. He had understood her feelings all too well. "Don't dwell on it," he murmured. "You have nothing to worry about. You think these things are normal for me?" He smirked slightly, but Chanty only frowned deeper, eyes narrowing at him in scrutiny. Vasper held her gaze with intensity. "I need you to understand something. Ever since you came into my life, you're the only one I crave. Even when women throw themselves at me, they mean nothing. You're the only one I want." His voice was unwavering, his fingers cupping her cheek as if to seal his words with his touch, his breath warm against her lips, intoxicating. Chanty stared into his eyes, her emotions wavering. A tear clung to her lashes before she whispered in a small, embarrassed voice, "I was still jealous, because she kissed you on the lips." A slow, pleased grin spread across Vasper's face, as if hearing those words from her lips brought him satisfaction. The possessiveness in her voice, the way she admitted her jealousy, only fueled his desire for her. "I'm sorry," he murmured in a husky voice, though they both knew he had nothing to apologize for. It had been Lauren's doing, not his. Still, he relished the way Chanty clung to him, the way she wanted him for herself alone. Chanty's face turned red, flustered, and before she could react, Vasper captured her lips again. Their kiss grew deeper, hotter, until their passion reignited like an unquenchable flame. Their bodies pressed against each other once more, hunger building between them, an unspoken need neither could resist. Just as they were on the verge of losing themselves again, Chanty gently pushed him away, their lips parting as they gasped for breath. Vasper. I need to return to Sylvan Concord, Chanty said between breaths. Mara will be bringing my breakfast soon, and I have an appointment with the 13 Council of the Crowns today. Vasper's expression darkened slightly. He exhaled deeply, nodding, but his grip on her remained firm, reluctant. I know, he murmured. Don't worry. I'll take you back to your chambers, but we still have time. His lips curled into a mischievous smirk. We have 30 more minutes. Before Chanty could protest, he pulled her back into his embrace, crushing her against his body as his lips found hers again. His kisses deepened, heat radiating between them. Chanty barely had a moment to resist, her hands were already gripping his arms, her breath hitching as she felt the undeniable evidence of his arousal against her. Once more, they gave in to their desires. The room filled with the sounds of their passion, gasps and moans echoing between the walls as they surrendered to the fire consuming them. It was raw, unfiltered, an insatiable hunger that neither could control. The world outside ceased to exist. Their bodies moved as one until, finally, they collapsed, both panting heavily, their bodies spent. Vasper lay draped over Chanty, his head resting against her neck, his breath warm against her skin. I love you, he whispered over and over, as if the words themselves could bind her to him forever, his voice hoarse with devotion. Chanty, struggling beneath his weight, let out a strained breath. Vasper. I can't breathe, you're heavy, she gasped, trying to push him off, her voice a mix of complaint and laughter. Vasper chuckled but propped himself up on his elbows, finally giving her some relief. Yet, just as Chanty was about to relax, he moved again, his hips rolling against hers, teasing her with slow, deliberate intent. She smacked his side playfully. I thought you said just one more time. We need to leave, she scolded, though her laughter betrayed her frustration. Vasper only grinned, eyes dark with longing as he gazed at her lips, his desire far from sated. I can't get enough of you, babe. He murmured, his movements slow but deep, making her body respond instantly, heat rising between them again. Chanty let out a breathless moan, unable to form words anymore. When Vasper's mouth found her breasts, all she could do was arch against him, her fingers tangling in his hair as he drove her into another spiral of pleasure. And once again, their passion consumed them, leaving them both lost in each other, time slipping away unnoticed, the world outside their embrace forgotten. Once again, the room blazed with the fire of their relentless passion. Their bodies moved as one, lost in a world of pleasure, unaware that they were being watched. On a large, high-resolution screen. Every movement, every whisper between Chanty and Vasper was captured in striking clarity. Two pairs of eyes remained fixated on the intimate scene from within an opulent chamber. Zalora and Havana. Zalora trembled with jealousy, her hands clenched into tight fists as she stared at the screen, tears welling in her eyes. Every moment she watched felt like a dagger slicing through her heart. Yet, she forced herself to endure it, refusing to look away, not wanting to miss a single detail. Beside her, Havana merely smiled, her jealousy concealed beneath a composed exterior. Unlike Zalora, she masked her emotions well. It had been Havana's doing. She had arranged for a secret surveillance camera to be installed in Vasper's chambers on the very day Alexander Mondragon had died. In fact, every corner of the palace had been outfitted with hidden cameras. An operation known only to 3 individuals, Zalora, Vladimir, and herself. I hate her. Zalora suddenly screamed at the screen, no longer able to contain her fury. Havana watched in amusement, unfazed by Zalora's outburst, as Vasper's voice filled the room. His endless declarations of love for Chanty piercing Zalora like a blade. They both envied Chanty. Not just for Vasper's words, but for the way he cherished her, the way he touched her with such care, the way he worshipped her body in ways neither of them had ever experienced from him. Zalora's lips trembled as she watched Vasper repeatedly kiss Chanty's face, whispering words of love after everything they had done. The tenderness, the passion. It was unbearable. Then, she snapped. A strangled scream tore from her throat, making Havana flinch in mild surprise. Zalora's face burned red with jealousy and rage, her entire body shaking. She glared at the screen, her breath ragged. "You will never be happy." She seethed through gritted teeth, her voice laced with venom. "I swear it." Havana, still smiling, turned to Zalora, her gaze sharp with quiet calculation. "Zalora, control yourself," she said coolly. "Remember who you are. Don't let your emotions rule you. Use your head." Zalora refused to look at her, unwilling to tear her gaze away from the screen. Even as she tortured herself by watching, she simply couldn't stop. Vasper's gentle caresses, his lingering kisses, the way he held Chanty so delicately. It was a sight she had never known for herself, and it shattered her. "He never did that to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. On the screen, Vasper's lips found Chanty's again, his hands roaming over her body with possessive adoration. Over and over, his voice rang clear. "I love you. I love you." Havana exhaled, shaking her head. "He's obsessed with her," she remarked, her tone indifferent. "The way you are obsessed with Vasper Mondragon." She glanced sideways at Zalora, her next words cutting like a blade. "You should already know that." Zalora flinched, but Havana didn't care whether it hurt her or not. "Instead of wallowing in jealousy, think about what's truly important. You need to convince the council and the kingdom that you should be the queen of Velantis Noctem." Havana continued, her voice carrying an underlying warning. "Set aside your feelings. Our future in Velantis is what matters most. Do you understand?" Zalora's nails dug into her palms as she listened. "I've already done my part," Havana added, crossing her arms. "I made sure to maintain my connections inside the palace, even after Vasper exiled me following Alexander Mondragon's death. I may no longer reside there, but I still have eyes within those walls." She gestured toward the screen. "Learn from me. Plan ahead. We have no magic, no special powers, nothing. But we still have our minds, and that is what we will use against those who stand in our way." Zalora inhaled sharply, then wiped away her tears, her expression hardening. Her eyes, however, never left the screen. And in that moment, Chanty rose from the bed. Zalora's gaze was razor-sharp as she stared at Chanty, her insecurities clawing at her from within. She knew she was beautiful. One of the most stunning princesses of her kingdom. But there was no denying Chanty's beauty either. It was an otherworldly kind of allure, something rare and striking. And now, as she watched Chanty completely bare before her, she could see everything. The perfect curves of her hourglass figure, the way her body flowed. From her chest down to her waist and hips, her long, graceful legs that exuded undeniable temptation. Yet, as mesmerizing as Chanty's form was, Zalora couldn't ignore the way Chanty struggled to walk. Every step was uncertain, as though she were in pain, as if her legs could barely carry her weight. Did Vasper overdo it? Zalora's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Vasper rise from the bed. Beside her, Havana's eyes gleamed with hunger as she openly admired him. Even she couldn't help but feel the heat spread through her body as she watched. She knew exactly what it felt like to be taken by Vasper Mondragon. To have him claim her in bed. But unlike Chanty, there had been no tenderness, no lingering touches, no whispered words of love. Just heat. Just hunger. Just pleasure without affection. "I understand you, Zalora," Havana said suddenly, a knowing smirk on her lips. "I understand why you're so obsessed with Vasper Mondragon." Zalora said nothing. She refused to tear her eyes away from the screen. They watched as Vasper lifted Chanty effortlessly into his arms, cradling her as though she were the most fragile thing in the world. "Does it still hurt?" he asked softly. Chanty only nodded in response. And then, just like that, they disappeared. Havana quickly switched through the surveillance feeds, scanning the entire room. But they were gone. They must have returned to Chanty's chambers. Havana muttered. A sharp crash echoed through the room as Laura shot to her feet, rage twisting her features. Her morning was ruined. Havana rose as well, and now they stood face to face, their gazes locked in silent challenge. I challenged Chanty to a fight, but Vasper refused. So Laura hissed, her voice shaking with frustration. I want to ruin that perfect face of hers. And Vasper already taken her virginity, that means she no longer holds the sword of destiny. She's nothing more than an ordinary being now. I can kill her with my own 2 hands. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms. Havana, however, only laughed. My dear, don't be reckless. She purred. You know that if you make a move, Vasper himself will stand in your way. And when that happens, you'll only drive him further away from you. So Laura's breath hitched, but Havana continued, stepping closer. If you want to win him back, then act like a serpent. She whispered, her tone laced with deadly amusement. Stay in the shadows. Stay silent. Don't reveal yourself. Don't let him know what you're planning. So Laura gritted her teeth, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew. She knew Havana would never comfort her, never acknowledge her pain. And yet, it still stung. But before she could respond, movement flickered on the screen. Vasper had returned to his chambers. Alone. He had teleported back, still clad only in his briefs. But this time, he moved with purpose, hastily searching through his cabinet for something unseen. Havana chuckled as she watched him. Would you look at that? She mused. A king who's nothing more than a fool in love. Then she smirked. At least he's handsome and irresistible, right? So Laura stiffened at Havana's mocking tone. She didn't like hearing Vasper being called a fool. Because he wasn't. She remained silent, her eyes locked onto him. Even in something as simple as searching his cabinet. Vasper exuded power, every movement commanding attention. He was mesmerizing, the way his body carried strength and grace, the way his mere presence could shake the ground beneath him. And yet, he was no longer hers. She no longer had the right to touch him, to hold him. That distance between them, that undeniable truth. Vasper detested her. Havana swallowed the ache rising in her throat, but Zalora caught the slight tremor in her hands. And then, Havana felt Zalora's eyes on her. She turned, their gazes locking. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Havana scoffed. Never mind. I just remembered Alexander. You know how it is. She shrugged dismissively and turned away. Zalora narrowed her eyes. Liar. Anyway. Havana continued, her tone shifting. Do you still have anything to do here? It was a subtle dismissal. Zalora clenched her jaw. But before she could respond, Vasper's deep, commanding voice suddenly rang out from the screen. I'll be leaving for 3 days. He announced to his servant, who stood at the doorway. Cancel all my engagements. There's something important I need to take care of. Their eyes flickered to the envelope in his hand. What was in it? And I'll be bringing Leica here. Vasper added. She'll stay in the palace while I'm gone. The servant nodded obediently before disappearing from sight. Then, as soon as the door shut, Vasper vanished, teleporting away. Zalora and Havana exchanged glances, the same question lingering between them. Where was Vasper Mondragon going for the next 3 days? The moment Zalora and Havana heard Vladimir's voice outside the door, Zalora immediately straightened herself, preparing to leave. She and Havana exchanged sharp glances before Zalora turned and walked toward the door. As she opened it, Vladimir stood before her, his stance reminiscent of Vasper Mondragon, tall, exuding confidence and power. His presence was almost overwhelming, impossibly handsome and strikingly attractive, traits he had inherited from Alexander Mondragon. It was no surprise. Like Vasper, Vladimir had piercing blue eyes, a feature he had gotten from his mother, Havana. He was dressed entirely in black, with a bandana wrapped around his head, holding back his long hair. His expression was one of curiosity as he gazed at Zalora, but he quickly masked it with a smile. Zalora, on the other hand, merely looked at him, her heart still heavy. "I won't be staying long. I have something important to take care of," Zalora said, meeting Vladimir's gaze. "Okay? Good morning, anyway," Vladimir responded from behind her as she turned away, not waiting for his reply. A small, amused smile played on Vladimir's lips as he watched Zalora walk toward the elevator. She wore a simple, casual dress, yet her beauty and allure remained undeniable, something he had admired for a long time. There had been countless times when he wanted to pursue her, but no matter what he did, she never gave him a chance. Her heart belonged only to Vasper, something Vladimir could never accept. Yet, he was still grateful that Havana and Zalora were friends, as it allowed him to see her often. But now, something had changed within him, his heart no longer beat for Zalora. Everything shifted the moment he laid eyes on Don Lorenzo. Ever since he first saw her in the desert with Jake Valerian, he couldn't get her out of his mind. However, once again, Vasper was in his way. Jake Valerian was dead, which should have removed any obstacles, yet now it was Vasper who stood in the path of reclaiming Don Lorenzo. And it was clear to everyone, Vasper intended to make Chanty his queen, the future ruler of Velantis Noctem. Everything in Vladimir's life, Vasper was always the one standing in his way. "Son, why are you here? What's the problem?" Havana's voice demanded an answer. Vladimir abruptly stepped inside the office the moment Zalora was out of sight and took a seat on the sofa. His eyes wandered across the massive screen on the wall, displaying every corner of Alexander Mondragon's palace, which now belonged to Vasper. A smirk formed on Vladimir's lips as he watched the display. "So? Any news? What's new? How's my bastard brother?" Vladimir asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Havana smiled knowingly. She was well aware of the deep-seated animosity between Vladimir and Vasper. Vasper took Chanty to his room, Havana informed him, her voice lacking enthusiasm. Vladimir's expression shifted instantly. He fell silent, waiting for Havana to continue. But as the minutes passed, she said nothing more. Suddenly, she stood up. "I have to go. I have business to attend to in the south. Vasper Mondragon will be gone for 3 days, and as usual, the work he left behind will fall on us to finish," she said, irritation evident in her voice. Vladimir let out a laugh, almost in disbelief at Vasper's irresponsibility. It was rare to see him act otherwise. His brother had no priorities except for his own personal endeavors. Why did he even become king? He doesn't care about Velantis. So many of our allies are just waiting for us to fall so they can take control of the kingdom, yet he does nothing. But... Vladimir stopped. He didn't want to utter the name Don Lorenzo. Havana simply listened to her son, though she was already prepared to leave the room. "Don't worry. I will do everything to ensure that you are the rightful heir to his throne, my son. For now, just follow the tasks we must accomplish, because when the time comes, we will reap everything we have sown," Havana said, her tone serious. Vladimir held his mother's gaze, equally serious. Every effort, every responsibility they had shouldered. It all had a purpose. Their ultimate goal was to seize total control from Vasper Mondragon. And now, Laika was returning. She was the one Vasper entrusted to oversee things in his absence. Vladimir's face darkened even more. He and Laika Mondragon never got along. She was vicious, bossy, demanding, and quick-tempered. The only reason they hadn't clashed outright was due to diplomatic courtesy. Laika hated Alexander Mondragon's mistresses, including Havana. Whenever Laika was in the palace, Havana couldn't even set foot inside. But there was nothing they could do. Laika was Alexander Mondragon's second in command, the one who managed all of his vast wealth in the outer world. Among Alexander Mondragon's many children from different women, only Vasper and Laika had inherited his power, his formidable genes. Meanwhile, Vladimir was nothing more than an ordinary being. And that was what Vladimir resented most about his fate. Why was he just ordinary? Why was he just like any other common person? Without another word, Havana exited the room and shut the door behind her, leaving Vladimir alone. Immediately, Vladimir grabbed the remote and rewound the security footage of Vasper Mondragon's chamber. His eyes remained sharp, unblinking, as he played the footage, watching until the exact moment when Vasper and Chanty teleported in the room. His gaze narrowed. His hands clenched into fists. He didn't understand what he was feeling as he stared at the screen. His body trembled. His fists tightened. And then, there she was. Chanty. Completely bare before his eyes. His admiration for her only deepened. She was breathtakingly beautiful, her allure utterly irresistible. He couldn't stop himself from reacting as he watched the scene unfold, the sight of Vasper and Chanty in bed. Together. And her voice. Her moans. The sounds that echoed through the speakers only heightened the fire within him. But more than that, more than desire, his jealousy toward Vasper burned hotter. That bastard is so damn lucky. Vladimir thought bitterly. He didn't even realize the sweat dripping from his forehead and down his neck, despite the cold temperature of the room. And at that moment, he finally understood. That was why Zalora's mood had been so heavy when she walked out. Inside the room, Vladimir sat staring at the screen, his sharp gaze fixed on Vasper. But with every glance at Chanty, his breathing grew heavier. The hidden camera was positioned right above the headboard, capturing every angle of the room with perfect clarity. Both the video and audio were crystal clear. Vladimir suddenly stood up, ripped off his shirt and the bandana from his head, and furiously threw them against the door, the force of his anger evident. He let out a loud, almost unhinged laugh as he continued watching the screen, especially as the moment between Vasper and Chanty neared its peak. His eyes burned into Chanty's face and body, watching as she reached closer to climax, her voice trembling as she moaned Vasper's name. What if he were the one in Vasper's place? Vladimir clenched his hair in frustration. And when he saw Vasper capture Chanty's lips in a deep, searing kiss, his rage nearly exploded. His fist shot forward, ready to punch the screen, and he screamed, his knuckles tightening. But just in time, he stopped himself. At that exact moment, the image shifted, and instead of Vasper, it was Chanty's face on the screen. Her eyes were closed, her lips parted, her breaths deep and uneven. Vladimir stood frozen. His heart pounded violently in his chest. Her bare body was displayed before him in stunning detail. His head felt light, as if he were floating. Without thinking, he reached out toward the screen, his fingers aching to touch her face. But just as his fingertips nearly met the glass, the image shifted again. Vasper was there once more, showering Chanty with kisses, whispering endless "I love yous" against her skin. Vladimir's entire body tensed. His temper snapped. Without hesitation, he swung his fist at the screen. But instead of shattering, the screen remained intact. Made of an indestructible, high-density crystal that could only be broken with a diamond cutter. His hand, however, wasn't as fortunate. Blood dripped from his knuckles, the deep gash oozing crimson. His breaths came out ragged, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he glared at the screen. Blood trickled down his fingers, staining the floor beneath him. Then suddenly, he laughed. A loud, eerie laugh. His head tilted downward as he stared at the floor, his laughter echoing through the room. He sounded deranged, almost psychotic. Grabbing a handful of paper towels from Havana's desk, he wiped the blood off his knuckles, then crouched down to clean the droplets on the floor. He even wiped the screen, but his laughter didn't stop. It was the laughter of a man on the edge. All the while, the soft murmur of Vasper and Chanty's conversation played in the background. Vladimir listened attentively. He watched Shanta's face, analyzing every emotion that flickered across her features with every word that left Vasper's lips. And then, he laughed again. But this time, he was laughing at himself. Why was he even reacting like this? He looked like a jealous boyfriend. The thought made him laugh even harder as he stared at the screen, his amusement twisted, bitter. But the moment Vasper started kissing Chanty again, Vladimir's expression darkened once more. His jaw clenched. His fists tightened. The screen played another intimate scene, Vasper's head lowered between Shanta's parted thighs, her moans echoing through the speakers. That was the breaking point. With a sharp, swift motion, Vladimir turned off the monitor. Every screen in the room shut down instantly, the images vanishing into nothingness. All that remained was the cold, black crystal wall. Vladimir let himself fall onto the sofa, his body landing heavily as his head rested against the backrest, legs spread out, staring up at the ceiling with half-closed eyes. He began to imagine how painful it must have been for Zalora to witness that scene. A part of him felt pity for Zalora. After all, despite everything, they were still friends. But the sudden change in his feelings for Chanty was something Vladimir couldn't comprehend. Was it simply his intense hatred for Vasper that made him feel this way? He glanced again at the screen, wanting to turn it on and watch, but his hand felt too heavy to press the remote. Sitting up straight, he looked down at his wounded fist. "You're going crazy, Vladimir. What's happening to you?" he muttered, laughing bitterly to himself. He realized he needed a woman to release the overwhelming emotions surging through him. Abruptly, he stood from the sofa, quickly picked up the clothes he had thrown earlier, put them on, and tied the bandana around his head. He was about to leave the room when he suddenly stopped in his tracks. In a moment of hesitation, he rushed back to the sofa, grabbed the remote, and turned the screen back on. The wall came to life instantly, and the first image Vladimir saw was Vasper and Chanty right at their climax. He saw how Vasper embraced Chanty tightly from behind, their lips locked together, her body trembling. Vladimir could hear their heavy breathing and moans. In his rage, he hurled the remote at the screen, aiming straight at Vasper's face as he kissed Chanty. Fortunately, the remote was sturdy and didn't break from the impact. It fell to the floor with a thud. Vladimir's eyes burned with fury as he stared at the scene, standing there, motionless. But then, he took a deep breath, trying to remind himself. Why do I even care? Why am I reacting like this? Yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He forced himself to watch the entire scene, even though his heart was on fire with anger and his body burned with desire. It was a strange sensation. His body craved release, but his heart seethed with rage. He kept staring at Shanta's body, her face, and the intensity of the moment. He didn't want to lose control. He didn't want to give in to his desires alone. Then he saw Chanty trying to stand up, though she was struggling to walk. Vladimir knew why. So, was this the first time something had happened between Chanty and Vasper since their father's death? It was clear that Chanty was in pain. Vasper had taken her virginity. Vladimir let out a bitter laugh. Anger and jealousy swirled inside him, his emotions mixing into an uncontrollable storm. Soon after, Chanty and Vasper teleported out of the room, disappearing from the screen. Vladimir waited a few more moments. Then, Vasper reappeared, instructing his servants that he would be gone for 3 days. At that, Vladimir finally turned off the screen, picking up the remote from the floor and shutting it down. He stormed out of Havana's office, slamming the door behind him, and quickly walked toward the elevator, heading down from his mother's building. But his face was dark, his expression unreadable. He needed a woman at that moment. And it didn't take long before a beautiful, elite woman from the kingdom of Velantis named Clementi arrived at his room in his own building. Clementi was one of the most esteemed women from Velantis Noctem, coming from a powerful family that owned numerous businesses related to minerals and precious metals. But even during their passionate encounter, it was Shanta's face that Vladimir kept imagining. Shanta's eyes closed, her lips parted, moaning. Vladimir was losing his mind. After they finished, Vladimir felt something missing. He wasn't satisfied, not fully. He stood up from the bed, completely naked, leaving Clementi asleep, exhausted and equally naked. He gazed at her face as he dressed, not bothering to wake her up. She had access to his room and other areas of the building, and there were servants ready to attend to her needs. Once Vladimir finished dressing, he quietly left the room, slipping out of the building, leaving Clementi behind, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside him. Vladimir stepped into Inferno Noctis, an elite underground club known only to the wealthiest and most powerful figures across the kingdoms. The moment he entered, a wave of lust-filled energy crashed into him. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, wine, and the unmistakable heat of bodies seeking pleasure. Golden chandeliers cast a sultry glow over the massive lounge, where men and women alike indulged in their deepest desires. The club was alive with whispers, laughter, and moans, blending with the heavy bass of slow, hypnotic music. He took a seat in one of the exclusive VIP lounges, his body sinking into the plush velvet couch. Several women instantly gravitated toward him. Goddesses of beauty with curves sculpted to perfection. Some had eyes like molten gold, others had skin that shimmered under the dim lights. A woman with deep crimson hair and emerald eyes slid onto his lap, her fingers tracing the exposed skin of his chest. "You seem tense," she purred, her lips hovering dangerously close to his ear. Another woman, with silver hair and dusky skin, pressed herself against his side, her warm breath fanning over his neck as her fingers trailed down his arm. "Tell us what you need, my lord," she whispered, her voice dripping with seduction. Vladimir exhaled sharply. His body reacted to their touch, but his mind, his soul, was elsewhere. He could still see Chanty. The curve of her lips as she moaned Vasper's name. The way her body trembled under his rival's touch. The soft, breathless cries that spilled from her lips. His blood boiled, jealousy scorching through him like wildfire. "More wine," he ordered, his voice sharp, desperate for distraction. A servant rushed forward, pouring him a deep crimson drink laced with Nerva essence, an exotic elixir known to heighten pleasure and numb emotions. Vladimir grabbed the glass, downing it in one swift motion, the liquid burning down his throat like fire. The women surrounding him took this as an invitation. The red-haired beauty straddled his lap, rolling her hips against him in a slow, agonizing rhythm. The silver-haired woman leaned in, her lips tracing along his jaw, teasing him with barely their kisses. Soft hands roamed his body, lips brushing against his skin, whispers of seduction filling his ears. His vision blurred. His breathing grew heavier. But still, Chanty haunted him. Her face replaced the women's. Her breathless sighs were the ones he heard. Her skin was the one he craved beneath his fingers. Damn it! He grabbed the red-haired woman by the waist and flipped her onto the couch, earning a playful giggle. He pinned her down, his body looming over hers. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw Chanty. A hallucination. A cruel trick of his broken mind. Her lips parted, eyes half-lidded, waiting for his kiss. But she whispered Vasper's name. "Vasper." Vladimir snapped. A growl ripped from his throat as he abruptly pushed himself off the woman, staggering back as his chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing ragged. "What's wrong?" The woman sat up, confused, her eyes glimmering with desire. Vladimir didn't answer. His body was hot, aching with unresolved hunger. But his soul was in agony. He turned away, storming past the dancers, past the walls of temptation, past the desperate hands reaching for him. His steps were heavy, unsteady, his mind drowning in the image of Chanty in Vasper's arms. By the time he reached the exit, his entire body was trembling. He punched the nearest wall, his knuckles splitting open again, fresh blood dripping onto the marble floor. He let the pain consume him. Because nothing, not wine, not women, not pleasure, nor power, could erase her from his mind. He was cursed. Cursed to burn for a woman who was never his to begin with. The cold air bit into Vladimir's skin as he stepped out of Inferno Noctis. But even the freezing wind couldn't cool the inferno raging inside him. The streets of the elite district stretched before him, golden-lit alleys filled with pleasure houses, gambling dens, and aristocrats indulging in their deepest sins. Yet none of it called to him. He was beyond temptation. He was drowning. Vladimir ran a hand through his hair, his bandana loosening. Before he ripped it off completely, throwing it onto the street. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his body heavy with unfulfilled hunger and burning jealousy. This is insane. She's just a woman. But she wasn't just a woman. She was his suffering. He pressed a hand to his forehead, his skin burning hot despite the cold. He needed something, anything, to break this obsession. A soft voice purred behind him. "Leaving so soon, my lord?" Vladimir turned, his eyes narrowing as a woman stepped out of the shadows, wrapped in nothing but a thin silk robe that barely clung to her shoulders. Her silver hair shimmered under the lamplight, her gaze filled with knowing mischief. "I had a feeling you wouldn't be satisfied," she murmured, stepping closer. Her hands traced the hem of his open shirt, her fingers feather-light against his skin. "I can fix that." Vladimir let out a hollow chuckle. Satisfaction? He wasn't even sure if he could feel it anymore. But he let her pull him, her fingers tangling in his wrist as she led him into a private chamber at the edge of the elite quarters. The moment they were inside, she pushed him onto a velvet chair, straddling his lap in one swift motion. "You want to forget," she whispered, her lips grazing his ear. Vladimir's hands gripped her waist out of reflex, his mind battling between control and surrender. Woman's lips trailed down his neck, her hands undoing the last buttons of his shirt. But then, Chanty's voice filled his head. "Vasper." Vladimir's entire body tensed. His fingers dug into the woman's waist too tightly, making her gasp. "Vladimir?" she murmured, confused. But Vladimir wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking through her. Because in the dim candlelight, in the way her hair spilled over her bare shoulders, in the way her breath fanned over his lips, she was Chanty. Or at least, his broken mind was making her into one. He reached out, cupping her face, not with desire, but with desperation. His thumb traced her lower lip, his gaze dark, tormented. "You're not her," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. The woman's eyes flickered with confusion. Who? A bitter smile curved Vladimir's lips. He didn't even have to say the name. It was already tattooed in his mind. And it killed him. Because no matter how many women he took, no matter how much he drank, no matter how deep he drowned in pleasure, Chanty belonged to someone else. And that truth broke him in ways he couldn't explain. His grip on the woman's waist loosened. "Leave," he ordered, his voice rough, cold. She blinked, stunned. "But..." "Leave." Something in his tone made her shiver. She slid off his lap, grabbing her silk robe before storming out without another word. Vladimir sat there, half-dressed, his chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. Then, he laughed. A low, bitter laugh, curling from his lips like smoke. The laughter of a madman. A man who had everything, power, wealth, women, and influence. Yet the only thing he wanted was never his to have. And that, more than anything, was his greatest curse. Vladimir staggered out into the chill of the early morning, the bitter tang of loneliness and regret burning in his throat. The club's neon glow dissolved behind him as he wandered aimlessly through deserted, rain-slicked streets. His mind, still ablaze with the searing image of Chanty, was a battleground where desire and despair clashed violently. After endless pacing along darkened alleys, he found himself drawn to a hidden speakeasy known as Obsidian Embrace. A den for the tormented and the elite, where shadows mingled with passion and pain. Inside, the atmosphere was a heady mix of incense, whispered secrets, and desperate longing. Men and women moved like phantoms, their eyes haunted by memories and desires that could not be quenched. In a secluded corner, Vladimir's gaze locked with that of a mysterious woman. Her features were striking. A delicate balance of fierce intensity and palpable sorrow. Her eyes, dark and deep, seemed to read the turmoil etched across his face. As she approached him, every step echoed the rhythm of his fractured heart. "Vladimir," she murmured, her voice soft yet insistent, a siren call that both beckoned and warned him. Before he could answer, she reached out and gently took his hand, leading him through a labyrinth of private rooms draped in lush velvet and bathed in the glow of candlelight. In one such chamber, the air was thick with unspoken longing. Her touch was tender at first. A tentative caress along his jawline, a soft whisper against his ear. For a fleeting moment, the warmth of her skin against his was the only comfort he felt. Yet every caress, every whispered promise in that dim room, tore him further apart. As their bodies intertwined in a desperate dance of fleeting ecstasy, the memory of Chanty's soft moans, the curve of her lips, and the haunting echo of Vasper's name surged through his mind. The more he tried to lose himself in the present, the more her phantom presence invaded his every thought. Their encounter became a cruel mimicry of solace. While the mysterious woman offered fleeting tenderness, each passionate moment reminded him painfully of what he'd lost. His senses, overwhelmed by the mingling of desire and despair, betrayed him. Her touch was as much a reminder of Chanty as it was a promise of escape. In the fevered climax of their union, when his body convulsed in a mixture of pleasure and agony, Vladimir's heart shattered further. Instead of the relief he so desperately craved, every pulse and shudder was imbued with the bitter knowledge that no amount of physical release could silence the torment of an unattainable love. As his body lay spent and trembling on the soft bedding, tears mingled with sweat on his flushed skin. The mysterious woman, her eyes mirroring his own anguish, caressed his cheek in a silent plea for understanding. But her touch, no matter how gentle, could not smother the relentless echo of Chanty's memory that haunted him still. In that silent, heavy moment, where dawn's pale light began to creep through the heavy curtains, Vladimir's soul lay exposed. He was surrounded by the trappings of luxury, the beauty of countless enchanting women, yet every sensual caress, every whispered word of comfort, was drowned out by the all-consuming image of Chanty. She was the ghost that possessed him, a love that would forever be beyond his grasp. Alone with his despair, he realized that the ecstasy of the night had left him more broken than before. His body ached for release, but his soul was tethered to a suffering that promised to consume him entirely. A curse of passion and loss that no fleeting distraction could ever dispel. Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper were on their private island beach, basking in the moment after Vasper had successfully convinced King Elander Valinor to grant Chanty at least a week's vacation. The king had not hesitated to fulfill Vasper's request. On the second day of their stay, they lay together on a bed set up by the shore, just as they always did before, to witness the sunrise. Once again, they had just emerged from an intense and passionate encounter, their bodies still attuned to the lingering warmth of desire. It was as if they were on a honeymoon. Chanty, spent from their lovemaking, rested her head against Vasper's arm, her body feeling as limp as a withered flower. In contrast, Vasper remained unshaken, his energy seemingly boundless. Perhaps because he was powerful, unlike her, a mere mortal without extraordinary abilities. She had tried several times to summon the Sword of Destiny back into her grasp, but it no longer responded. The prophecy was true. Once she lost her virginity, the sword would disappear from her body forever. Still, she felt a strange sense of relief. Her mission was complete. Now, she longed to return to her vineyard, though she was deliberately delaying it. She wanted to avoid Samara. If Samara found out she had been there, it would only stir up trouble. David would undoubtedly become the target of her endless wrath once again. A strong breeze swept through the beach, causing their thick comforter to flutter slightly, brushing against their exposed skin. Beneath the covers, they were completely bare, with Chanty locked tightly in Vasper's embrace. Their gazes met. Silent, deep, speaking volumes without a single word. "I can't believe I have you in my arms again, babe," Vasper murmured in a hushed, intimate voice. "I went through hell just to get you back." His grip on her tightened possessively. After this, my coronation is next, and then I want our wedding to follow, both in the inner world and here in the outer world," he declared, excitement gleaming in his blue eyes. Chanty only responded with a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed something else. A sadness that did not escape Vasper's keen gaze. He gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his intense stare. Their eyes locked for a long moment before he lowered his lips to hers, kissing her. Deep, slow, passionate, overflowing with love. A low hum escaped Vasper's throat as his lips remained against hers, inhaling her breath as if he could never get enough. Even after claiming her countless times, he still burned for her, insatiable. "I want to know what you're thinking, babe," he whispered against her lips. "Will you tell me?" Chanty only responded with a soft moan. Vasper's eyes searched hers. "Are you happy with me? Are you happy that we're here?" His voice was low, coaxing. "Tell me where you want to go next, I'll take you anywhere." Chanty hesitated, her voice breathy as she asked, "You won't get mad?" "No," Vasper replied with a small smile. "Why would I?" Even his blue eyes seemed to smile at her. They held each other's gaze in silence before Chanty finally spoke. "Honestly, I miss Jake." At that moment, everything fell into an eerie stillness, as if they had been transported into a secluded cave where only the whisper of the wind and the distant hum of insects filled the air. Vasper smiled, but there was a flicker of pain in his eyes. "It's embarrassing to admit, but I'm jealous of a dead man," he muttered, his deep voice carrying a weight he couldn't hide. "It's not what you think, Vasper," Chanty said, shaking her head. "I can't explain everything to you, but you have nothing to be jealous of. I've come to terms with the fact that my heart belongs only to you. You are the only man I have ever loved like this, and I will love you for as long as I live." Her words brought light back into Vasper's blue eyes. Joy swelled in his chest, as if he had been lifted into the heavens. Without hesitation, he seized her lips in a searing kiss. Long, deep, burning with love, a whispered vow of devotion. "It took so long for me to hear those words from you," he murmured against her lips, his hands roaming her bare back, tracing down to her hips. "I just don't want your ego to get too big if I keep saying it all the time," she teased, pouting. Vasper let out a full, unrestrained laugh, the kind that showed all his teeth, bright and utterly mesmerizing. Chanty found herself enchanted, helpless against the sheer allure of his presence. When he laughed like that, he became even more devastatingly handsome, almost hypnotic. She had never seen anyone, neither in the inner world nor in the outer world, who could surpass his beauty. Or perhaps, she thought, it was simply because she loved him too much that no one else could ever compare. And so, she continued to stare at him, utterly captivated. Chanty's gaze never wavered from Vasper's face. Not even as he laughed. She watched him intently until his laughter faded, leaving them locked in another deep, unspoken connection. "You were right. I won't deny it," Vasper murmured, his voice laced with certainty. "Hearing that from your lips only boosts my confidence even more. But can you blame me?" His tone softened, turning into something raw, something vulnerable. "You're the only woman I've ever loved like this, babe, the only one." Chanty's heartbeat quickened. Heat bloomed in her chest, rising to her cheeks, turning them a shade of soft crimson. Vasper didn't miss it. He felt it, saw it, just as he always did. And in that moment, he captured her lips again, sealing their unspoken emotions in a kiss. "You are my paradise," he whispered against her lips. "My one and only burning paradise." Chanty pulled back slightly, her eyes glimmering with playful curiosity. "And why burning?" she asked, feigning innocence. Vasper let out a laugh, utterly amused by her question. "Because anyone who enters your life, burning with overwhelming love and the desperate desire to claim not just your heart but your very being, will be consumed by that fire." Vasper's voice was deep, possessive, filled with raw hunger. "You're intoxicating, babe. You're my only happiness. My paradise." His words left Chanty momentarily speechless. her mind reeling as she listened. That deep? Huh? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Uh-huh? Vasper responded without hesitation. Vasper, Chanty murmured, hesitating before continuing. I want to go home. To Jake's house. I need to see it, to put his things in order. I need Lorena's help. A heavy silence settled between them. Vasper said nothing at first, but he understood. He understood her need for closure, even if it meant facing something painful. Don't worry, he said at last. After tomorrow, I have to return to Velantis for a council meeting. I'll take you to the mansion, and I'll come get you later that night. Chanty offered him a small, grateful smile. But tomorrow night, I want us to have dinner at the Paris restaurant. I already made a reservation. It's a place I've always wanted to take you. His blue eyes gleamed with determination. And this time, I don't want to hide us from the public. I don't care if they see us together. Alexander is gone. There's no longer anything or anyone to hide from. Chanty didn't reply. She simply listened. I want to marry you here in the outer world, babe. Vasper continued, his voice deep, firm, and undeniably possessive. I want everyone to know that you're mine. There was no mistaking the ownership in his tone. Prepare yourself for our wedding day in Velantis, he added. Chanty exhaled a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of it. But what about the Sylvan Concord's plans against you? She asked, concern evident in her voice. I don't know what they're planning yet. King Elander and I haven't discussed it further, Chanty admitted. And the Guardians, they're against you, Vasper. You know that. I know, he said. But don't worry. Everything is already in motion. I'm just waiting for the right moment to change the laws of Velantis, for the good of everyone. Even if I am no longer king, I want to ensure my kingdom is protected. Chanty frowned at his words. You don't plan to rule Velantis? No. Vasper shook his head. I want to stay here, in the outer world, with you, babe. This is where we will build our legacy. This is where our bloodline will flourish. There was a dreamlike quality to his voice, as though he could already see the future he envisioned so clearly. Chanty gazed at him, wondering how he intended to make all of this happen. How he planned to avoid whatever dark schemes King Elander had against him. Lyca will take my place in Velantis, Vasper announced. And Jacob will be her king. Shanta's eyes widened in shock, but she said nothing. Jacob just needs to remember who he really is. Vasper continued, his tone unwavering. Alexander erased his past. But once he regains his memories, he'll remember Lyca. He'll remember everything. Shanta stared at him, mouth slightly open in disbelief. Jacob is the only one meant for Lyca. No one else, Vasper stated with absolute certainty. They're both fire incarnate, but there's a difference. Jacob's flames can freeze as well as burn. He can control his fire, make it either scorching or ice-cold. Vasper's bluish eyes gleamed with hidden meaning. But not in battle, not in war. His true power only manifests in the bedroom. Shanta's forehead creased in confusion. Lyca can't be with an ordinary man, Vasper explained further. Her fire would consume him. Literally. But with Jacob, he smirked. Jacob can control Lyca's flames. Only he can tame her. In other words, when Lyca is in a state of arousal, her body ignites. Flames burst from her skin, burning any man who dares touch her. Shanta's eyes widened at Vasper's revelation. Her imagination began running wild, painting vivid images of what he had just described. I'm still searching for the witch who holds the key to Jacob's lost memories. The ones Alexander erased. Vasper's voice darkened. Ever since Alexander took them away, Jacob hasn't remembered Lyca. Chanty remained silent, absorbing every word. Laika never wanted to leave the inner world. Vasper continued. She stayed because of Jacob. But Alexander had other plans. He wanted Laika to manage his connections here in the outer world. He didn't trust anyone else but his own blood. Jacob had been an obstacle. And so, Alexander removed him. That was the reason for their separation. Laika had no choice but to live in the outer world. Vasper added. Because Jacob no longer remembered her. He saw her as an enemy. And to make things worse, he became a guardian. Vasper was about to say more, but when he turned to Chanty, he found her already asleep. Her lashes resting gently against her cheeks. He chuckled softly, realizing he had talked her to sleep. He knew she was exhausted. And yet, he couldn't blame himself. There wasn't a single moment when he didn't want to claim her as his own. He was only giving her a chance to rest. I'm sorry, babe. I can't get enough of you. He whispered against her lips. Chanty's soft breathing, followed by a faint snore, reached his ears. Vasper inhaled deeply, savoring her scent, his self-control wavering as he resisted the urge to squeeze her tightly against him. I love you so much. He murmured again and again. And with that, he fell asleep beside her, smiling. That night, Vasper felt an overwhelming sense of peace. After all the suffering, after losing her once, Chanty was finally back in his arms. Even in sleep, his lips remained pressed against her forehead. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Chanty stirred awake, her consciousness pulled back by the sensation of warm kisses trailing along her lips and cheeks. She let out a soft, sleepy moan, signaling that she was awake. But she kept her eyes closed. She knew it was Vasper. He didn't stop. He continued pressing kisses to her lips, teasingly slow, until she finally opened her eyes. Only to be met with his smiling face. In just a few moments, the sun will rise. He murmured in that velvety voice of his. Chanty turned her gaze toward the horizon. Slowly, the sky was shifting colors. The darkness melting away as the first light of day broke through. Vasper watched alongside her, his expression calm, peaceful. Mirroring the serenity of the sea before them. It's beautiful, isn't it? He whispered. We never got to see this in the inner world. Chanty nodded, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. She couldn't believe they were doing this again. Watching the sunrise together, just like they used to. And then, as the sun fully emerged, the entire sky and ocean transformed into a dazzling display of gold and fire. It was like magic. A symbol of new beginnings. A fresh start. A new life. Just like them. They were beginning again. Their love was untouched by time, unshaken by trials. No matter what they faced, it would never break. As the sun's brilliance became too blinding to watch, Vasper suddenly teleported them. Bed and all. Back to the mobile home. The sudden shift made Chanty gasp as the cool air conditioning wrapped around her skin. Before she could fully register the change in surroundings, Vasper was already hovering over her, showering her with kisses, on her cheeks, her lips, her neck. And just like that, one kiss turned into another. And another. Until the air between them ignited once more. Soon, the mobile home rocked with their movements, their bodies moving as one, lost in the fire of their passion. They didn't care. They only had each other. Their moans, their whispers of love, filled every corner of the small space, drowning out everything else. And as the morning stretched on, Chanty felt the pain in her core slowly fading away. Perhaps because of how relentless Vasper was. Or perhaps because the pleasure was beginning to outweigh everything else. Yet even after their passion reached its peak, once, twice, thrice, Vasper didn't stop. By the time he finally let her rest, Chanty lay limp, breathless, completely spent. Vasper kissed her face, her neck, his fingers tracing lazy circles along her skin. I love you, babe. He murmured under his breath. Then, with a grin, he whispered, I'll cook us breakfast. Chanty barely had the energy to respond. She simply nodded, smiling weakly. "I'd love to help," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you wore me out. You're unbelievable, Vasper." Vasper chuckled, clearly amused by her reaction. Leaning down, he kissed her again, long and deep, before finally getting up. He didn't bother putting on a shirt, only slipping into a pair of boxers as he made his way to the small kitchen. Before leaving, he tucked the blanket around Chanty, making sure she was warm. Then, with one last glance at her sleeping form, he smiled to himself. And so, with love still lingering in the air, Vasper began to cook. After a while, Chanty woke up to the sensation of Vasper's lips pressed against hers, his kiss slow and claiming. His firm grip on her breast sent a shiver down her spine. His lips trailed down, leaving warm kisses along the delicate curve of her neck. "Good morning. Let's have breakfast," he murmured against her skin. Chanty let out a soft moan, instinctively swatting at Vasper's wandering hand still cupping her breast. She knew where this was going. He might start again. Vasper chuckled, watching her flushed face with an amused yet dark gleam in his eyes. To avoid what was bound to happen next, Chanty suddenly sat up, slipping out of bed in one swift movement. She grabbed the blanket and wrapped it around herself, feeling the hunger stir in her belly at the enticing aroma of whatever Vasper had cooked. Behind her, Vasper laughed, his gaze never leaving her as he noticed her deliberate effort to avoid another intimate moment between them. Chanty stood, clutching the blanket tightly against her chest to shield her bare body, but in an instant, Vasper yanked it away. "Vasper!" she shrieked, caught off guard as the fabric slipped from her grasp. Her nakedness was laid bare before him. Heat rushed to her face as she instinctively covered herself with her arms. Vasper only grinned, his deep laughter echoing in the room before he pulled her toward him, capturing her in a tight embrace. "I love you, babe," he murmured against her lips before kissing her deeply, passionately. "I want you to be my breakfast. But look at the time. It's already past 9 a.m. You need to eat something." His lips moved against hers, stealing the breath from her lungs. Chanty felt her thoughts blur, drowning in the sensation of his lips. So soft, so intoxicating. Her mind fogged, unable to think straight. When Vasper finally pulled away, she was left breathless, staring at his lips, now curved into a teasing smile, his sharp teeth flashing at her mischievously. Before she could recover, he reached for the bathrobe on the headboard and slipped it onto her shoulders. Then, with no warning, he lifted her effortlessly into his arms. Chanty gasped. The next moment, they teleported outside the mobile home. Before her, beneath the shade of a large beach umbrella, a beautifully set table awaited. 2 chairs faced each other, and atop the table were an array of dishes, an elegant pasta dish, seafood cooked to perfection, tropical fruits, and a pitcher filled with fruit juice and a bottle of wine. But what caught her attention the most was the bouquet of red and white roses placed on one of the chairs. Chanty's hands flew to her mouth. Flowers? She could hardly believe it. Vasper never liked flowers, especially bouquets. They reminded him of his mother's death. He despised them. Yet, here they were, resting on her seat as if he had deliberately placed them there for her. Vasper picked up the bouquet and gently guided her to sit. Without a word, he handed it to her. Chanty accepted it hesitantly, bringing the flowers to her nose and inhaling their sweet fragrance. A smile bloomed on her lips. "Thank you, my love," she whispered, her voice velvety and warm. Vasper froze. Chanty did too. Realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She had only ever called one person my love before. Jake. The man she had loved. The man who was no longer here. A heavy silence settled between them. Chanty hesitated, staring at Vasper. He didn't seem hurt, nor did he look angry. But there was something unreadable in his expression. "I want to call you my love," she admitted softly, lowering her gaze. I don't like calling you babe. Vasper seemed to snap out of his trance, then chuckled, settling into his chair. Well, I don't think anyone would mind if you used those words for me now. Right? He said with a smirk. Without waiting for her response, he casually handed her a plate of pasta, lobster, and prawns, as if the moment before hadn't affected him at all. Chanty placed the flowers gently on the empty side of the table and picked up her fork. They began to eat, their lips curving into smiles between bites. She couldn't stop praising the taste of Vasper's cooking, utterly amazed that he had prepared such an exquisite meal. She hadn't expected him to be capable of making something so delicious. Especially the lobster and prawns. Vasper only grinned as he watched her, taking pleasure in her delight. And just like that, the weight of the past slipped away, leaving only the present moment between them. The fresh oysters lay on a bed of ice, glistening under the warm sunlight. Chanty delighted in the taste, squeezing a bit of lemon onto each one before savoring its smooth, briny flavor. Across from her, Vasper watched her with quiet amusement, his eyes filled with warmth as she enjoyed the meal. Every so often, they glanced at the shoreline, mesmerized by the breathtaking beauty of the ocean. The crystal-clear water shimmered like liquid sapphire, calling them to take a swim. Vasper poured himself a glass of wine, while Chanty opted for fruit juice. They raised their glasses in a light-hearted toast, the clink of crystal echoing softly between them. Then, without a word, Vasper stood and approached her. He reached for her hand, gently pulling her to her feet before leading her to his chair. With ease, he guided her onto his lap, his arms wrapping securely around her waist as he gazed into her eyes. "This is the life I want," he murmured, his voice deep and resolute. "To be here with you, in a paradise like this." Chanty held his gaze for a long moment. "This is what I want too, Vasper. But how?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "You're destined to be the king of Velantis. I don't want to live there. I want to stay here, in the outer world." A small smile played on Vasper's lips. "As I told you before, everything is already planned. Let me make it happen. Let me set us free, so we can live here without worries," he assured her. "And if we ever get bored, we can travel, to the city, to the mountaintops, to anywhere you wish. Name the place, and I'll take you there." Chanty listened, a spark of excitement lighting up her eyes. That was exactly what she wanted. To see the world. It had always been her dream. Once, Jake Valerian had taken her on journeys across different parts of the world. But back then, her heart had been shattered. Because of what had happened between her and Vasper. Her gaze drifted toward a ruined structure in the distance. The remains of the house she and Vasper had once shared. Memories of their time there flooded her mind, bittersweet and unshakable. Vasper followed her line of sight and let out a quiet sigh. "I don't want to think about how that house was destroyed," he admitted. Then, after a pause, he added, "But you know, I want to build a new one here. A house like Jake's, on the cliff overlooking the sea." Chanty froze. She knew exactly what house he was referring to. Jake's home, perched atop a massive rock, surrounded by the endless ocean. It was like a dream, a sanctuary, a place that held memories too precious to erase. And then she whispered, almost to herself, "Jake and our yacht is still there." Vasper stiffened. Silence fell between them. A sharp pang twisted in Vasper's chest. Even though Jake was just a memory now, jealousy still gnawed at him. "He bought another yacht?" Vasper muttered. "After I destroyed the last one?" Chanty nodded. "That's the yacht we took. We sailed far away, to a beautiful island. It was that night. The night Jake defeated you in the race. That's where we went afterward," she said softly. Vasper studied her face carefully, reading the emotions that flickered across her features. Sadness. Longing. A pain that hadn't completely faded. Even now, he couldn't help but feel envious of Jake. I still can't stop being jealous of him, Vasper admitted in a low voice. Chanty fell silent. She turned her gaze toward the ocean, her heart heavy with unspoken emotions. There was still a part of her that ached for Jake. A part that would never belong to anyone else. Let's not talk about it anymore, she whispered. Vasper didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her closer, tightening his hold on her before capturing her lips in a deep, lingering kiss. When he finally pulled away, a playful smile crossed his face. "Let's go for a swim," he said. "The water is perfect. When we go back to the inner world, there won't be anything like this." Without warning, he reached for her bathrobe and tugged it off. Chanty gasped, instinctively clutching at the fabric. She had nothing underneath. But Vasper didn't stop. The robe slipped away, leaving her bare before him. His gaze raked over her body, admiration gleaming in his eyes. "It's just us here on this island," he murmured, his voice husky. "No one else. Only me, looking at you." A slow, satisfied smile curved his lips as he took in the sight of her. And in that moment, Chanty felt the heat of his gaze like fire against her skin. Vasper stripped off his shirt and shorts, leaving only his boxer briefs. His toned body gleaming under the golden sun. Without hesitation, he reached for Chanty's hand, guiding her toward the water. Her bare feet sank into the warm sand as they walked, her silhouette radiant, glowing like a goddess against the endless blue horizon. Her hair cascaded down her back, catching the light in soft waves, her beauty an ethereal reflection of the sea itself. Vasper's gaze never left her. Every movement, every breath she took, held him captive. When they reached the water, the waves lapped at their skin, cool against the growing warmth between them. The depth reached Vasper's chest, and with effortless strength, he pulled Chanty closer, lifting her with ease. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, their bodies drawn together in a dance as old as time. A shiver ran through her as she felt the undeniable energy between them, her pulse quickening, breath hitching. Vasper's arms secured her against him, his grip firm yet reverent, his touch igniting an undeniable fire. Their eyes locked. A silent conversation passing between them, an unspoken promise sealed in the way their hearts raced in sync. Then his lips found hers. Hungry yet tender, a kiss that stole the breath from her lungs, leaving her weightless in his embrace. She melted into him, surrendering to the passion that surged between them, the rhythm of their movements guided by a force greater than themselves. The waves wrapped around them, a silent witness to the storm they created together. "I love you, my love," Vasper murmured against her lips, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, my love," Chanty whispered back, her voice trembling with the depth of her feelings. It was a confession long overdue. A truth she had kept buried for too long. Vasper stilled for a moment, as if engraving those words into his soul. Then a slow, breathtaking smile spread across his lips. "Say it again," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers, his arms tightening around her. She gazed into his eyes, filled with longing and devotion, and repeated in a voice as soft as the breeze, "I love you, my love." A deep, satisfied exhale left his lips before he captured her in another kiss, this one lingering. Reverent, an oath. A binding promise sealed in the depths of their souls. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that from you again." The waves continued to embrace them as they held on to each other. Lost in the moment, lost in their love. And Chanty could only moan under the heat of Vasper's kisses. They had just finished. Yet, Vasper seemed eager to begin again, refusing to pull away from her. She could still feel the intensity of him unchanging, unwavering. "Let's go inside my room, where the bed is sturdy," Vasper whispered. And just like that, their surroundings shifted. From the ocean's waves, Chanty suddenly found herself sinking into the softness of a plush bed. A small gasp escaped her lips, quickly followed by laughter as she landed on the comfortable mattress. The rich scent of scented candles filled her senses, and as her eyes adjusted, recognition dawned on her. The ornate ceiling above her confirmed it. She was in Vasper Mondragon's chamber. Vasper chuckled softly as well, his lips never leaving the curve of her neck. "We need to be here because the bed won't make noise or move around. We wouldn't want our mobile home to collapse now. Would we?" he teased. Chanty laughed at the implication, knowing exactly what he meant. If they had continued inside the mobile home, it might not have withstood the fervor of their passion. Within the intimate confines of the room, only their heated breaths and quiet gasps filled the air. Then, the pace changed. Vasper shifted positions, allowing Chanty to straddle him. She moved, her body swaying with an intoxicating rhythm, and Vasper watched her in awe, utterly mesmerized by her beauty. He traced his hands along her thighs, gliding upward, savoring every inch of her skin. His fingers trailed over her waist, caressing the curve of her hips, memorizing the shape of her body. As Chanty continued her movements, Vasper couldn't help himself. He gripped her waist, guiding her with his hands, his touch firm yet reverent. His palms roamed further, mapping out her form with reverence and devotion. "You are breathtaking, my love," Vasper murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. Chanty heard him, felt the truth in his words, and she leaned into his touch. Her fingers braced against his thighs as her body arched, her lips parting in a breathless moan. She was close. So close. Vasper sensed it too. His grip tightened on her waist as he took over, setting the pace, his movements deliberate and deep. Chanty gasped, her hands clutching his legs for support as she threw her head back, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, his name slipping past her lips in a fervent cry. Their names intertwined, called out in ecstasy. Vasper bit his lip as he stared up at her, utterly entranced. She was more beautiful than ever in that moment. Her radiance, her movements. It was all-consuming. As the intensity built, their synchronized rhythm became undeniable, and the tension coiled tighter and tighter until it finally unraveled in the most electrifying release. One final movement, deep and grounding, sent them both spiraling over the edge. Chanty pressed down against him as their bodies trembled in sheer pleasure. Eyes shut, breath uneven, she absorbed every second of the overwhelming sensation. Before she could even regain her senses, Vasper had already pulled her into his embrace, his hold impossibly tight. "I love you so much, my love. I love you," he whispered against her ear, as Chanty buried her face into his chest, still trying to catch her breath. Vasper brushed damp strands of hair from her face, lifting her chin so their eyes could meet. "I love you," he repeated, his gaze deep and unwavering. He traced his fingers over her slightly parted lips, admiration shining in his eyes. "I love you too, my love," Chanty whispered back. The moment she spoke, Vasper captured her lips in a kiss, slow, passionate, filled with love and longing. "You have no idea how much happiness you bring me. You are everything to me. I need nothing else in this life," Vasper murmured between lingering kisses, his voice heavy with emotion. "Shall we return to our beach?" he asked, though he didn't wait for her answer. In a blink, they vanished from the bed, teleporting back to their paradise island, leaving behind only the faint traces of their presence in the now empty bed of Vasper Mondragon's room. Yet, unbeknownst to them, they are being watched in that moment. A pair of piercing eyes. From afar, a pair of cold, watchful eyes had seen everything. Vladimir. He was inside Havana's office, within his mother's grand building, tasked with monitoring the palace while Havana attended to matters in the south with the elites. Vladimir had been watching the entire time. And now, he sat frozen, his gaze dark and unreadable as he stared at the screen. His eyes locked onto the bed of Vasper Mondragon. Vladimir's body trembled, a whirlwind of emotions crashing within him. He couldn't understand it. Now, his gaze was locked onto the shattered bottle of liquor he had hurled at the screen moments ago. When he saw Vasper's face resting against Chanty's bare body, His heart burned with fury. Why was he feeling like this? Was he jealous? He knew he had no right to be. Yet he couldn't accept the emotions raging inside him. Why did he feel this way about Chanty? He had never felt this for Zalora, even back when he desired her. Maybe because he had never witnessed Zalora and Vasper together in such an intimate moment. But the difference was undeniable. Unlike before, he could hardly sleep now, constantly haunted by thoughts of Chanty Lorenzo. The image of Chanty straddling Vasper's body, moving in rhythm, her moans filling the air. Vladimir couldn't erase it from his mind. It was like pouring fuel into the fire already raging inside him. A fire he knew he would never be able to extinguish. His breathing was ragged as he struggled against the emotions clawing at him. But the rage and jealousy toward his brother, Vasper, only deepened. "I'm going insane," Vladimir muttered to himself before letting out a frustrated scream, his fists pounding the screen repeatedly. Over and over, Chanty's voice echoed in his ears, whispering, "I love you too, my love." Meant only for Vasper Mondragon. There was no cure for the pain Vladimir felt. No antidote could put out the flames that burned within him for Chanty. Not even the countless women he sought pleasure from could smother the fire consuming his body. No remedy. No escape. How could he possibly erase Chanty from his heart and mind? When Zalora had occupied his thoughts, he could still sleep soundly. But ever since Chanty entered his life, there hadn't been a single night without dreams of her. Was he burning in his own obsession? Whatever this feeling was, he despised it. It shattered his concentration. Chanty dominated his thoughts, his every waking moment. He needed to free himself from this torment, but he knew there was no solution. There were countless women in their kingdom, most of them throwing themselves at him, save for those who were obsessed with Vasper Mondragon, the ones he actually wanted, yet they only desired his brother. All he ever wanted was to become the king of Velantis Noctem. It had been his lifelong dream, his mother Havana's ultimate wish. But it was impossible, not while Vasper Mondragon existed. The sole heir of Alexander Mondragon. If only he had power like Vasper Mondragon. But he was just an ordinary being. Despite all his efforts and dedication to Velantis, the Council of the Dragons never saw him. They only favored Vasper because of his overwhelming strength. Vladimir's ragged breathing filled the room as he stared down at his bloodied fists. Slowly, he sank onto the sofa, his clenched hands resting on his lap as his lips pressed into a thin line. After a long moment, he stood again, grabbing a scarf, his mother's, that was draped over the table. Wrapping it around his wounded hand, he wiped the blood off the screen and floor, cleaning up the mess left behind by his outburst. He collected the shards of broken glass, making sure to erase every trace before his mother could see it. He even deleted the recording of what he had watched. And inside the office. Why? He didn't know. But whatever the reason, it had to remain his secret. He couldn't let his mother find out about his feelings for Chanty Lorenzo. Just as he was about to leave the office, stepping through the door, he saw Zalora approaching with a smile. He stopped, waiting as she walked up to him. He returned her smile, though faintly. "Sorry, I just got here. I had something to take care of," Zalora said, referring to their shift change in monitoring the palace footage. They couldn't entrust this task to anyone else if Vasper discovered their surveillance. All their plans could fall apart. "It's nothing. I was just about to leave," Vladimir replied. "Really? Please, stay with me for a while. I brought food," Zalora said, lifting a small plain white paper bag. "Sorry, Zalora, but I have something important to do." Vladimir excused himself, quickly stepping toward the elevator while giving her a small wave. Zalora frowned, noticing the scarf wrapped around his hand. This was the first time Vladimir had ever turned her down. Before, he had never refused her, no matter what she asked of him. But she brushed the thought aside and entered the office, unaware of the storm raging inside Vladimir Mondragon. Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper were having dinner together. Using Vasper's teleportation abilities, they visited Chanty's mansion, which was nearing completion. As Chanty gazed through the window at a closed, tinted car parked outside, tears welled up in her eyes. Sensing her emotions, Vasper gently squeezed her hand. "I want to be the one to finish this mansion. I already spoke to David about it," he said. Chanty was reminded of Jake, who had once said the exact same words to her. They continued their journey to Chanty's vineyard but chose not to step out of the car, instead observing the land through the windows, careful not to be seen by anyone. As Chanty sat there, silent tears fell down her cheeks, and Vasper pulled her into an embrace. The loneliness she felt was tied to the memories of her parents, a sorrow that weighed heavily on her heart. At that moment, Vasper sensed David's presence inside Building 1. Almost instantly, David stepped outside, scanning the parking area. His gaze landed on their car, but he did not make his presence known. Despite the tinted windows, David's heightened abilities allowed him to see Chanty and Vasper clearly inside the vehicle. However, he chose not to react, simply turning back and re-entering the building. Realizing the situation, Vasper started the engine without hesitation and drove away from the area. Their visit to the vineyard was brief, lasting only moments before they left. As Vasper drove down the highway, Chanty's gaze drifted into the distance. She watched the bustling city. Cars speeding past, towering buildings, people walking along the sidewalks, leading ordinary lives. She longed for that kind of normalcy, a simple existence free from the complications that defined her own life. Vasper noticed the way Chanty stared at the road ahead, lost in thought. He reached out, placing his palm over her hand, which rested on her lap, and gave it a reassuring squeeze. A silent reminder that he was there. Chanty turned to look at him. He gave her a fleeting smile before refocusing on the road. But Chanty's gaze lingered on him. The white long-sleeved polo shirt he wore was neatly rolled up to his elbows, the top buttons undone, revealing a glimpse of his chest and well-defined muscles. He looked effortlessly handsome, with his hair tied in a half ponytail. A few loose strands framing his forehead. In the outer world, Vasper's true identity was unknown to most. Only a select few knew who he really was. But even they didn't fully grasp the truth. Who would have thought that he was a king? A ruler of a hidden kingdom in the inner world? A being of immense power? One who could teleport, possess super strength, wield supernatural abilities, and even read minds? Chanty let out a soft sigh, her gaze tracing the length of Vasper's exposed forearm as he gripped the steering wheel. He heard her sigh and, sensing her attention on him, smirked with amusement. "Why? Is your husband just too handsome?" he teased, exuding confidence. Chanty's mouth fell open as she gawked at him. His arrogance was infuriating, mainly because it was true. Vasper glanced at her, then suddenly burst into laughter, shaking his head in amusement. As they reached a red light, he turned to her fully, his eyes narrowing with mischief as his broad smile revealed perfect teeth. His laughter was contagious. And just like that, Chanty found herself mesmerized again. She stared at him, captivated by the way his handsome features became even more striking when he laughed. Without warning, Vasper took her hand, brought it to his lips, and pressed a soft kiss against her skin. "Thank you for letting me make you smile, even just for a moment," he murmured, his voice brimming with warmth as he gazed into her eyes. Then, just before the light turned green, he leaned in and kissed her lips. Brief, yet deep with meaning. And as the signal changed, Vasper stepped on the gas, speeding toward his building, taking Chanty with him. As soon as they reached his private parking space, Vasper wasted no time. With a firm yet gentle pull, he guided Chanty onto his lap, positioning her so she straddled him. His hands gripped her waist, steadying her, making her feel every inch of him beneath her. Chanty followed his silent command, moving with him as if they were already one. The air between them was thick with anticipation, charged with an undeniable need that neither of them could suppress. The moment she settled against him, Vasper's lips crashed onto hers, urgent, claiming. His mouth trailed from her lips to her cheeks, down the curve of her jaw, and onto the soft skin of her neck. She gasped. As his breath sent shivers across her body, the whispered heat of his voice making her tremble. "I love you," he murmured against her skin, his words a promise, a plea, a declaration. His hands were already roaming, fingertips teasing the hem of her dress, slipping beneath it, tracing the length and smoothness of her thighs. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the fabric upward, exposing more of her to him. Chanty lifted her arms, surrendering completely, and Vasper wasted no time in pulling the dress over her head and casting it aside. The moment she was bare before him, his hands moved to the clasp of her bra, unfastening it with expert ease before tossing it behind them. His breath caught as he took her in. For a second, he simply stared. His hungry gaze drinking in the perfect curves of her body, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her skin flushed under his devouring eyes. His hands moved on instinct, cupping, worshipping, his touch reverent yet possessive. "You're perfect, my love," he rasped, his voice thick with need. Chanty couldn't even form words. Her response came in the form of a shuddering moan as his lips followed where his hands had been, his touch igniting fire along her skin. The limited space of the car only pressed them closer, their bodies molding together, their heat merging as one. When his hands found the lace of her underwear, she lifted her hips, allowing him to slip them down her legs. The anticipation between them was unbearable now. Every second stretched, thick with tension, every touch sending a deeper ache through their bodies. Then, in one swift movement, Vasper removed the last barrier between them. A sharp gasp escaped Chanty's lips as he claimed her completely, their bodies finally fusing into one. A guttural moan rumbled from Vasper's throat, his hands gripping her waist as if grounding himself in the overwhelming sensation of her. Chanty clung to him, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck, their lips meeting in a heated kiss that left them both breathless. Vasper adjusted the seat, pushing it back slightly to give them more room, though the tight space only added to the intensity of it all. He loved the way their bodies were pressed together. No distance, no air, just heat, desire, and an unstoppable rhythm that left them both trembling. Chanty's hips moved against him, each motion sending waves of pleasure through them both. Vasper groaned against her lips, his grip tightening as he guided her movements, matching her pace with his own. "You're mine," he growled, his voice dark with possession, his grip almost bruising as he pulled her closer, deeper. She moaned in response, the sound raw, desperate. Every second that passed only heightened the intensity. The pleasure was unbearable. Intoxicating. As the tension built, their movements became more frantic, more desperate, their bodies moving in perfect sync, chasing the inevitable. The car rocked slightly with the force of their rhythm, the air inside thick with heat, heavy with their mingled breaths. "Oh my God!" Chanty gasped as she felt herself unravel, her body shattering in waves of pure, unfiltered pleasure. Vasper's eyes locked onto hers, dark, intense, brimming with raw emotion as he chased his own release. His grip on her tightened, his name falling from her lips like a prayer, and at that moment, nothing else existed. Only this, only them. With a final, shuddering groan, Vasper buried himself deeper, his body trembling against hers as he reached his own peak, pulling her into a desperate, searing kiss as their pleasure consumed them both. For a few moments, they remained tangled together, their bodies still locked, their breaths mingling as they slowly came down from the high of their shared ecstasy. Vasper's arms remained firm around her, as if refusing to let her go, his lips pressing lazy, lingering kisses against her skin. But then, without a word, without a warning, the world around them shifted. A pulse of energy crackled in the air, and in the blink of an eye, they were no longer in the car. Silken sheets replaced the cool leather beneath them. The dim glow of Vasper's penthouse bathed them in soft light. And yet, even here, their hunger for each other had not faded. Because Vasper was no ordinary man. And exhaustion was a weakness he had never known. On the fourth day, Chanty remained inside the mansion she once shared with Jake, accompanied by Lorena, David, and Justin. They had been transported there by Vasper using his teleportation powers. That day, Vasper had to return to Velantis Noctem for an important meeting with the allied rulers of the realm. His presence was crucial. Now, in the grand living room of the mansion, Chanty stood facing Vasper, who was ready to leave. His eyes were filled with worry as he gazed at her. If his meeting wasn't of utmost importance, he would never leave Chanty alone in the outer world. But duty called. "Don't worry," Vasper reassured her, his voice gentle yet firm. "Before 8 p.m., I'll be back. We'll have dinner together, all right?" Chanty met his gaze and nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Vasper's eyes wandered across the room and landed on the massive wedding portrait of Chanty and Jake that adorned the mansion's walls. His stare grew sharp, the jealousy within him still burning. It had never faded. "Have this removed as well, won't you?" Vasper muttered, his eyes still locked onto the portrait. Chanty followed his gaze and stared at the image of her and Jake. A deep sadness flickered in her eyes. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. But in her heart, she felt the ache of longing for Jake. She missed him. She missed everything about him. Vasper noticed the way Chanty kept staring at Jake's face in the portrait, the way her emotions flickered in her eyes. But he refused to speak of Jake. He didn't even want to hear his name. "I'm leaving now, my love. Wait for me tonight, I'll come back for you," Vasper reminded her before pressing a deep kiss onto her lips. He held her tightly in his arms, as if reluctant to let go. Meanwhile, outside by the swimming pool, David, Justin, and Lorena stood watching Chanty and Jake's 2 horses. An elven staff had been left behind to take care of the mansion and the animals. David and Justin, however, were also listening to the conversation inside. They exchanged glances, speaking only with their eyes. Then they heard Vasper's voice from inside the mansion. "David, I'm leaving." "All right," was all David said, his gaze shifting to Justin. And just like that, Vasper vanished before Chanty's eyes. She let out a quiet sigh and sat down on the sofa, her eyes drifting around the mansion. Everywhere she looked, she saw pieces of her past with Jake. The dining table where they once shared meals, the staircase they used to climb together, their wedding portrait still hanging on the wall. The memories were fresh, too fresh. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Her heart ached for Jake. She could still vividly remember how he died, how he took his last breath in her arms. "I'm so sorry, Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. David, Justin, and Lorena entered the mansion, their expressions heavy with sorrow. "Just tell us what of Jake's belongings you want to keep, and we'll help you sort through them," David said softly, looking at Chanty. Chanty quickly wiped her tears and turned to face him. That day, with the help of David, Justin, and Lorena, Chanty packed away Jake's belongings. His portraits were taken down and stored in Jake's office. When they reached the master bedroom, Chanty couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She broke down, sobbing as memories of her life with Jake flooded her mind. Lorena didn't disturb her, allowing her to grieve in silence. When Chanty finally calmed down, Lorena quietly re-entered the room. Among the items Chanty had kept from Sylvan Concord was Jake's uniform, their wedding rings, and some of his clothes. They were still packed in her suitcase from Sylvan Concord. It was already late afternoon when they finally finished. Lorena and the elven staff prepared food in the kitchen while Chanty, David, and Justin sat at the dining table, talking. David then handed Chanty a stack of letters. She accepted them and glanced at the top one. It was from Jasmine. Slowly, she opened the envelope and began reading in silence while David and Justin watched her closely. Then, suddenly, tears fell from Chanty's eyes as she read. The letter expressed Jasmine's condolences for Jake's death. It was in this letter that David and Justin officially informed Jasmine that Jake's death had been caused by a plane crash. But there was another piece of news: Jasmine was pregnant. With Marco's child. She and Marco were planning to marry soon, before her belly grew too big to hide. Jasmine had sent a wedding invitation, hoping that Chanty would attend. The mix of emotions overwhelmed Chanty: grief, longing, and a small sliver of joy for Jasmine. She took a long time to recover from the weight of her feelings. Justin handed her a glass of water, and she drank slowly, trying to steady her breath. And in the silence of that moment, Chanty realized, no matter how much she wanted to hold on to the past, life was moving forward without her. Chanty was still in shock upon learning about Jasmine. It felt too fast. Jasmine and Marco, now expecting a child and rushing into marriage. David sat in front of her, his expression serious. Marco and Jasmine's wedding is already set. The date is confirmed, and everything is ready. Hopefully, by then, you'll be able to attend. Justin smirked slightly. The younger sibling getting married before the older one, he remarked, throwing a teasing glance at David. Chanty felt a sudden warmth rise to her cheeks, slightly embarrassed by what Justin had just implied. It doesn't matter who gets married first, David said firmly. What's important is that you're sure about the person you're marrying. Justin chuckled, amused at David's reaction. But still, shouldn't you be getting married first? Justin replied, but David ignored him. Justin just smiled. Less than 2 weeks from now, Vasper Mondragon's coronation will take place. And right after that, your coronation as Queen of Velantis Noctem. David added. Chanty was silent. Even now, she still couldn't fully grasp the weight of what was about to happen in her life. The room fell into an uneasy silence. David, I don't know what the king has planned, but I'm begging you. Please. Just leave me and Vasper alone. Chanty pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. I don't want you two to become enemies, not after everything we've been through. David didn't answer immediately, but his eyes held a deep, unreadable emotion. Justin, too, observed the conversation, quietly assessing the weight of the moment. What mattered more to David? His duty as a guardian, sworn to follow the king's will? Or his friendship with Don Lorenzo? Chanty broke the silence with a revelation that left David visibly stunned. Vasper has no intention of becoming king of Velantis. He plans to pass the throne to Lyca. And Lyca. She has chosen Jacob as her future king. David and Justin exchanged sharp glances. That's impossible. Justin countered. Jacob's memories are gone. Lyca is no longer part of his past. Vasper is searching for the witch who holds the key to restoring Jacob's memories. Chanty replied, her tone unwavering. Justin locked eyes with her. Good luck with that. He scoffed. We've been searching for that witch for years. Not a single trace, no proof if she's even alive or already dead. Chanty exhaled, frustration evident in her expression. Then, without warning, she turned to David and asked, David, weren't you supposed to be the king of Sylvan Concord? Her question sent another heavy silence between them. David and Justin looked at each other. Neither spoke. After what felt like an eternity, David finally broke the silence. You've been to the library, haven't you? Chanty simply nodded. Then you already know. David muttered. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. But I don't want to talk about it. Chanty lowered her gaze. I'm sorry, she whispered, regretting bringing it up. It's fine, Chanty. David reassured her. His voice was calm, showing no sign of anger. Justin gave a small smile, but then Chanty's voice became hushed, almost fearful. David, something has been bothering me. Before Alexander died, he said that King Elander was the reason my mother was killed. Justin and David immediately locked eyes, their expressions darkening. I'm not saying I believe him. Chanty added hesitantly. But... She paused. David's voice was sharp. He was a liar, Chanty. There's no reason to believe anything he said. Justin, however, wasn't as quick to dismiss it. His gaze lingered on David, studying his reaction. Then Chanty spoke again, her voice trembling. What will happen to me if I refuse to follow the kingdom's will? David and Justin fell silent once more. Then, finally, David spoke. Then we'll complete the mission in your place. Chanty's heart pounded. She turned to David, searching his eyes for any sign of hesitation. David, do you mean? She couldn't even finish her sentence. David's expression remained unreadable, but his next words sent a cold chill down her spine. When the time comes, we will eliminate Vasper Mondragon. Just as we planned with King Elander. Chanty felt as if ice-cold water had been poured over her. Justin and David were both watching her closely, gauging her every reaction. Trembling, she clenched her fists. "If you go through with this, David, I will have no choice but to fight you." David sighed, his voice calm yet heavy. "I knew this would happen. I knew from the start how much you love Vasper. But Chanty, you are not our enemy. And I will never fight you." His words were steady, resolute. Justin remained silent, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes as he watched Chanty's expression twist in pain. Then he finally spoke. "Besides, for Jake's sake, we have to do this." His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words lingered in the air. Chanty felt her body weakening as the weight of David's words sank in. She knew how serious he was in his role as a guardian. "Do you still have the sword of destiny?" David asked calmly. Chanty's face instantly turned red. Humiliation etched across her expression. David understood her reaction, and without a word, he and Justin exchanged knowing glances. "For now, we don't have a problem," David continued. "I don't know when King Elander will summon us again. With Jake gone, the plan is bound to change. We just have to wait." Chanty remained silent, struggling to find the right words to say. How could she even begin to voice what was running through her mind? "Chanty, no matter what happens, we are not enemies," David reassured her. "Vasper is our enemy, not you. It's not your fault that you fell in love with someone our clan considers an enemy. But I hope you understand my duty and responsibility." Still, Chanty did not answer. "Vasper knows about this, doesn't he?" "I know he does," David said. "He's not foolish. But since King Elander is currently tolerating him, things remain peaceful, for now." Chanty swallowed hard before speaking. "The king's will is bound to happen regardless. If Jacob stands beside Alexander Mondragon and Velantis, then everything will still fall into place." But despite her composed words, her body betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly. And David and Justin both noticed. "Let's see what the king decides," David replied. "But Chanty, let's make things easier. It would be best if you didn't tell us about Vasper's plans for the two of you. That way, I won't feel the weight of knowing. When the time comes for me to carry out my duty." Justin nodded in agreement. "It's hard to explain, but everything is complicated because of your feelings for Vasper," David continued, locking eyes with her. "And that's something none of us can change." Chanty took a deep breath, steadying herself. "David, I don't want to fight you." Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind her words. "A warning." David and Justin both grew serious, absorbing the gravity of her statement. But then, David smiled faintly before speaking again. "Chanty, like I said, you are not our enemy. Even if you get angry at me, even if you decide to fight me, nothing will change. Nothing can change what we are to each other. I hope you understand that." A heavy silence settled between them. And then, after a long pause, Chanty spoke once more. "David, don't go to the vineyard. It's no longer necessary. I have people who will take care of everything. My secretaries will handle it while I'm away," Chanty said firmly. David fell silent, while Justin let out a deep sigh. "All right, I understand. No problem. But we still need to finalize Jake's remaining affairs, and all the necessary documents are in my office. We should discuss everything there with your lawyers," David said. Chanty didn't reply. Her eyes, however, welled up with unshed tears. David's words carried only one meaning: they were going to kill Vasper, following King Elander's orders. "Let's change the subject, Chanty," David said gently. "The entire city and the vineyard already know. Your husband, Jake Valerian, is gone. He died in that plane crash." A heavy silence lingered in the air. "But don't worry," David continued. I promised Jake I would guide you through everything he left behind until you're strong enough to handle it on your own. And I will keep that promise." Chanty remained silent, staring down at the table, avoiding David's gaze. David understood. He knew none of this was easy for her. "That's why I ask of you, Chanty. No matter what happens between us, between me and Vasper Mondragon when that time comes, please, don't see me as your enemy. Because I don't see you as mine. To me, you are family." His voice was unwavering, but there was a certain softness to it. "No matter how much resentment you might feel toward me, I won't fight back," he continued. "I made a promise to your father, Chanty. I am a man of my word. I swore to protect you, no matter what happens, along with my brothers." Justin gave a solemn nod in agreement. A single tear slid down Chanty's cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. Justin stood up, walked over to the living room, and grabbed a box of tissues. He placed it in front of her, and without hesitation, she took one and dabbed at her tears. David watched her intently. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Our mission. It's only about Vasper," he added, as if trying to ease her pain. "Don't worry, Chanty," Justin suddenly said, trying to lighten the mood. "For all we know, things might turn out differently. Maybe it won't be Vasper who disappears. Maybe it will be us. After all, Vasper Mondragon isn't someone to be taken lightly. He's powerful." Chanty snapped her head up, eyes narrowing at Justin. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Justin. David." She burst out. "I don't want any of this to happen. Any of you, any of the Guardians. You are like family to me. Do we really need another loss? Does there really need to be another Jake?" Her voice trembled with desperation as she turned to David. "Please, David." She reached across the table and grasped his hand, her fingers tightening around his. A heavy sadness settled over them. "You don't understand our duty, Chanty," David said quietly. "It's hard to explain." He sighed, staring at their joined hands before looking into her eyes. "I wish I could explain it to you, make you understand. But just like you, could you explain to me why you chose Vasper over Jake? Why you chose to love him even when he is the enemy of our bloodline?" His words weighed down on her like an anchor, dragging her deeper into an ocean of emotions. A tense silence filled the room. The only sounds that remained were the faint clatter from the kitchen and the quiet sobs escaping Chanty's lips. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from David's grasp. Her heart felt unbearably heavy. She didn't know how to protect the people she loved anymore. David and Justin's faces were solemn, watching her with quiet concern. But there was nothing they could do except let her grieve in silence. "I have broken so many rules already," David continued after a moment. "The code of conduct. I violated it, for Jake, for your marriage, for your relationship with Vasper. But this time, forgive me, Chanty. Because we have a duty to fulfill. A burden placed on our shoulders." As the weight of his words hung in the air, Lorena entered the room, carrying trays of food and an elven staff. No one spoke. They simply watched as she carefully set the food on the table. "Lorena, join us," Chanty said softly. Lorena smiled politely but shook her head. "I'll eat with the elves in the kitchen. I prefer it that way." Chanty nodded in understanding, offering her a small, grateful smile. And then, they ate. Silently. No one spoke a word. It was clear that Chanty had no appetite, but she forced herself to take small bites, pushing the food around her plate. By the time the meal ended, the staff had finished clearing out Jake's belongings. His portraits were gone. "David, you and Justin can use Jake's car in the garage to get home," Chanty said quietly. David and Justin exchanged looks before nodding, smiling faintly. "Lorena will stay here with you," David added. "At least until Vasper comes to get you. That way, you'll have someone to talk to." Chanty gave him a small smile and shook her head. "No, David. I'll be fine here. Thank you for everything. Her voice was soft, sincere. Thank you, David. Justin. Lorena. David gave her a small nod. And then, as she walked them to the garage, silence fell over them. Once again. More than an hour had passed since David and his companions had left the mansion. The rain began to pour heavily, drumming against the roof and rippling through the surface of the swimming pool. The sound of the downpour echoed through the vast estate, intensifying the gloom that had settled in. Meanwhile, Chanty was in Jake's room, her eyes swollen from crying, burdened by the weight of her troubles. She didn't want anything bad to happen to Vasper. Yes, he was powerful. But she knew better than to underestimate the strength of the 6 guardians. They were formidable, especially when united. How could Vasper possibly defeat all 6 of them without anyone getting hurt? She had seen them fight before. Each possessed unique abilities. Unmatched strength, extraordinary speed. Jacob wielded his fearsome blue fire, Lewis controlled objects with his telekinesis. And the combined might of Gabriel, David, Marco, and Justin, with their enhanced strength and speed, made them nearly unstoppable. What if they all attacked Vasper at once? A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't want to think about it. More than anything, she didn't want harm to befall the guardians. They were family to her now. Especially David and his siblings. Lying on her back, Chanty stared at the ceiling, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. Why is my life like this? What should I do? Wiping away her tears, she suddenly heard a loud noise outside the mansion. A powerful explosion echoed through the stormy afternoon, followed by the frantic neighing of 2 horses. Chanty bolted upright from the bed, her heart pounding. She rushed to the door, summoning her elven staff as she hurried down the staircase. Her curiosity was piqued. What was happening outside? Through the grand windows, she saw the heavy rain beating down on the land, the world outside cast in darkness, only illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning. The wind howled like an enraged beast, rattling the mansion's windows. She glanced around the living room, then the kitchen, searching for the elf. But he was nowhere to be found. A sudden bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, followed by a deafening thunderclap. Something felt wrong. I have to check on the horses myself. Grabbing an umbrella from the antique vase near the door, she hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. The moment she pushed open the door, the wind nearly knocked her back, whipping against her clothes. She made her way past the swimming pool, heading toward the gazebo, the path leading to the horse stables. As she neared the gazebo, another violent streak of lightning tore across the sky. Startled, she let out a scream, her umbrella flipping inside out. The wind was relentless, and within seconds, she was drenched, her clothes clinging to her frame from the force of the downpour. And then, she saw him. A shadowy figure stood before her. Chanty gasped, almost dropping the umbrella. Her breath hitched in her throat as the man suddenly reached out, catching the handle before it could slip from her grasp. His fingers wrapped around hers, steadying the umbrella over them both. Their eyes met. Her heart stopped. Vladimir Mondragon, half-brother of Vasper Mondragon. She stood frozen, her mind racing. Vladimir. How? Why are you here? The questions tumbled in her mind, but her lips could only form a single whisper. How had he found her? How did he even know where her mansion was? Without another word, Chanty turned on her heels and rushed back inside. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear Vladimir's footsteps following her. Silent. Unwavering. Once inside, she hesitated. Despite her confusion, she couldn't exactly turn him away. He was, after all, the brother of her boyfriend. As a gesture of goodwill, she led him to a guest room on the ground floor, instructing him to freshen up. Quickly, she fetched some of Jake's spare clothes from the cabinet, just a simple t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Fortunately, there were still a few pieces left. She rushed back downstairs, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders as she knocked on the guest room door. The door swung open. Chanty's breath caught in her throat. Vladimir stood there, shirtless. A towel hung loosely around his waist, droplets of water trickling down his sculpted torso. He smirked as he reached for the clothes in her hands. Chanty, determinedly, did not look at him. Without a word, she turned on her heel and hurried away. Back in the master's bedroom, she changed into dry clothes. Tight jeans and a simple white shirt. She left her damp hair loose, letting it cascade down her back. But even as she dressed, her thoughts wouldn't settle. Why is Vladimir here? What does he want? Descending the stairs once more, she was caught off guard by what she saw. Vladimir was already seated on the sofa, now dressed in Jake's clothes. His long, dark hair was still slightly damp, strands clinging to his face. He sat with his legs spread apart, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers clasped together. His gaze was fixed on her, intense and unwavering. Something about the way he looked at her sent a shiver down her spine. His stare wasn't just deep. It felt like it was piercing through her very soul. Chanty swallowed, suddenly feeling awkward. Does he always stare like this? Shaking off the thought, she continued her descent. Coffee or tea? She asked, trying to distract herself. Vladimir didn't blink. His eyes never left hers. Coffee. With sugar? Or without? No sugar, please. A faint smirk played on his lips, as if he found her amusing. The way he smiled, it was strikingly similar to Vasper's. Without another word, Chanty turned and walked toward the kitchen, heading straight for the coffee machine. From where he sat, Vladimir had a clear view of her as she moved. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. Chanty could feel Vladimir's intense gaze on her. As soon as she finished preparing the coffee, she carefully carried it, making sure not to spill a single drop. But before she could reach him, Vladimir stepped forward to take the cup from her. She handed it to him slowly, the delicate porcelain plate supporting the steaming drink. Just then, Chanty noticed the rain outside growing stronger, the wind howling as it lashed against the glass walls of the mansion. The storm was relentless. Vladimir followed her gaze, observing the turbulent weather. They both sat down on the sofa, facing each other. You? Vladimir asked. His eyes locked onto hers. No thanks. Chanty replied. How did you end up here? She asked. Chanty, still studying him, fired back her own question. How did you get here? A small smirk played on Vladimir's lips as he took a sip of his coffee. Yet his sharp gaze never wavered from her face. I was just passing by. He finally answered. I was in my vehicle when the storm hit. Lightning struck, and my vehicle crashed just behind your house. Sorry if I startled the horses. But don't worry, they weren't harmed. Chanty's mouth slightly parted in disbelief. Really? Her voice carried doubt. It's just a coincidence that lightning struck you right here. In front of my house. What are the odds? And it just so happens that you know the owner? Do you want to believe me or not? Vladimir countered, his smirk widening before he let out a deep, hearty laugh. At that moment, Chanty saw it. The unmistakable resemblance to Vasper Mondragon. There was no denying they were brothers, even if they had different mothers. I'm sorry, Vladimir said, amusement still flickering in his eyes. But you look even more beautiful when you're angry. His words hung in the air, thick with tension. Both of them fell silent, the atmosphere shifting, heavy with an unspoken charge. Yet, Vladimir's stare remained unrelenting, deep and unreadable. Breaking the silence, he casually added, By the way, thanks for the coffee. You actually make a good cup. He took another sip, savoring the warmth before flashing her a grin. And thanks for the clothes. His gaze dropped briefly to his borrowed outfit before returning to Chanty. But Chanty didn't respond. She was still waiting for the real answer, the truth behind his unexpected arrival. Their eyes met again. This time, Vladimir's gaze dropped to her lips, lingering for a brief moment before he abruptly looked away, shifting his focus to the rain streaking against the glass wall. Vasper is coming later. Chanty finally spoke, glancing at the wall clock. Vladimir smiled, but it never quite reached his eyes. You still haven't answered me, Vladimir. Why are you here? How did you know I was here? Were you looking for me, or for Vasper? Vasper went back to Velantis, and Chanty started to explain. But Vladimir cut her off. I'm here for you, he said firmly. Silence. Chanty's breath hitched. Her eyes burned into Vladimir's as she studied him, searching for hidden intentions. But then, something shifted in his expression. His once calm gaze darkened with sorrow and unease. What do you want from me? She asked cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. Vladimir clenched his fists, his body tense as he stood abruptly. Chanty's eyes followed his every move, her nerves on edge. She didn't trust him. Even if he was Vasper's brother, that didn't mean she could let her guard down. Chanty subtly moved further away from him, settling herself at the center of the sofa, putting more distance between them. They continued their silent battle of stares, neither willing to back down. Don't be afraid. Vladimir finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. I won't do anything to hurt you. But Chanty wasn't convinced. I need you to know something. He continued. Zalora has something planned against you. Chanty's stomach twisted. She stared at him in shock, unable to find words. Vladimir pressed on. When you return to the inner world, don't leave your protective dome unless Vasper is with you. If possible, always have your personal bodyguards around, no matter where you go. Zalora and her family are getting desperate. The council meeting earlier didn't go well. Zalora is furious with you. His voice deepened, laced with a warning. Chanty shivered, a cold fear creeping up her spine. Where is Vasper? She asked, her voice trembling. He's still in Velantis, handling the meetings. There are many matters he needs to take care of. Vladimir explained. Zalora stormed out in anger. I was with her. I was the one she sent to make sure her plans would succeed. A sudden wave of alarm surged through Chanty. Her instincts screamed at her to put more space between herself and Vladimir. She jumped to her feet, stepping away from him. But Vladimir moved just as fast. Chanty, listen. He urged, reaching out to stop her. No. She cried out, her voice shaking. Leave, Vladimir. Go back to your people. I've done nothing wrong to any of you. Listen to me. Vladimir insisted. That's why I'm here. To warn you. To make sure you stay alert. Vladimir explained, his voice soft but firm. Chanty froze. Their eyes locked. Why are you doing this? Why should I believe anything you say? She demanded, her voice laced with distrust. I don't even know which of your words to believe, Vladimir. I don't know you. All I know is that you're the son of the woman Alexander chose over Vasper's mother. And from what I've heard, you and Vasper Mondragon don't get along because you want to take the throne for yourself. She spoke plainly. Her words sharp and unfiltered, repeating what Vasper had told her. Vladimir fell silent, his expression unreadable. Until a bitter smile slowly formed on his lips. Wow. So you already have me all figured out. He muttered. What else do you know about me? Nothing more. That's all. Chanty replied coldly. I don't even know what kind of person you truly are. But one thing is certain. I don't trust Vasper's siblings. Vladimir chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Only pain. Leave, Vladimir. Chanty said firmly, pointing toward the door. Vladimir merely glanced at her outstretched hand but made no move to leave. Instead, He sank into the sofa. "I'm not leaving until Vasper gets here," he declared. "Why does he let you stay here alone? Is he insane? Does he not realize how many of his former lovers are furious at you? Why don't you have bodyguards? Why is it just that elven staff? Look at them, they're already asleep. No one's watching over you. This is unbelievably irresponsible." His voice rose in frustration. Chanty sat in stunned silence, absorbing his words. "I sent my guardians home," she finally answered. Vladimir suddenly burst into laughter, loud and mocking. "So your guardians are idiots too, Don Lorenzo," he said, shaking his head. Chanty's eyes widened in shock. "You have no right to say that, Vladimir," she snapped, anger flashing in her eyes. "And what do you call what they did? Leaving you alone like this? The future queen of Velantis, abandoned in her own mansion? Why do you sound like my father?" Chanty shot back. "I'm old enough to take care of myself. I'm tired of people following me everywhere I go. Besides, they had important things to do. Their lives don't revolve around me." "But this is different," Vladimir countered. "Your life is constantly at risk. If you're not careful, you could end up dead. There are a lot of people who want to bring you down. Just because of your boyfriend." Chanty exhaled sharply. "Why are you doing this, Vladimir?" she asked, her frustration growing. Vladimir didn't answer. He just stared at her. "Does there have to be a reason?" he asked quietly. His gaze was serious, unwavering. "Everything has a reason, Vladimir," Chanty shot back. Vladimir leaned back against the sofa, resting his head against the cushion. He let out a deep sigh, staring at the ceiling. "Leave," Chanty repeated, her voice tense. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Chanty screamed, her body instinctively jumping in fright. She lost her balance, stumbling backward. But before she could hit the ground, strong arms caught her. Vladimir. Their faces were inches apart, their breathing ragged. His arms tightened around her, holding her close. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Chanty shoved him away, breaking free from his grasp. "I told you to leave," she snapped, pointing at the door once more. "I'm not leaving until your boyfriend gets here," Vladimir repeated stubbornly. Chanty glared at him, her frustration boiling over. "Why are you doing this, Vladimir? I don't understand. What do you want from me?" she demanded, her brows furrowing in anger. Vladimir didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, long and hard. "Do you really want to know?" he finally murmured. Chanty didn't speak, but it was clear she was waiting for his answer. Vladimir exhaled. His voice dropped, his tone raw with emotion. "Ever since I saw you in the desert with Jake Valerian," he began. "From that moment on, you've been stuck in my head. You've been messing with my thoughts. I can't sleep. I feel like I'm losing my mind thinking about you. I can't focus on my work because of you. I don't understand myself anymore. I'm always exhausted because you're the only thing I think about." His voice wavered, thick with frustration. "What the hell did you do to me?" he whispered, pain evident in his tone. Chanty froze. She stared at him, stunned, as if cold water had been dumped over her head. She couldn't move. Her entire body felt numb. Fear crept into her chest. Alarm bells rang in her mind. "Vasper, please come home." The words echoed in her head, over and over again. Slowly, she took a step back. Vladimir sighed heavily, rubbing his face in frustration. "Stupid," he muttered under his breath, gripping his hair. That was it, Chanty panicked. She bolted, dashing toward the stairs. Vladimir could only watch in stunned silence as she ran, disappearing up the steps. He stood frozen, unable to believe her reaction to his confession. Did she see him as some kind of monster? Moments later, he heard the sound of a door slamming shut. Hard. Vladimir let out a deep sigh, staring at the staircase. I can't blame you, he murmured to himself. His eyes fell on his empty coffee cup. A small, ironic smile formed on his lips. She had made him coffee. That meant something, didn't it? He got up and walked toward the coffee machine, brewing himself another cup. He took a slow sip, letting the warmth seep into him as he gazed out the glass walls. He would wait. He would wait for Vasper to return before leaving. Maybe he really was going insane. Why was he doing this? He knew full well that Vasper would probably kill him if he found out how he felt about Chanty. And yet, he had chosen this path. He had accepted the consequences. Strangely enough, he felt lighter. At least he had finally said it. Even if it wouldn't end well for him. Screw it. That was the only thought left in his mind.